Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The rusted gate screamed against its hinges as I forced it open, the sound cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a wounded animal's cry. Wonderland Park had been dead for 17 years, but somehow it felt like it was still breathing, shallow, labored gasps of a place that refused to die completely. I hefted my camera bag over my shoulder and returned to my rented van, parking it near the entrance plaza where weeds pushed through cracks in the asphalt like grasping fingers. The headlights swept across a faded sign, "Welcome to Wonderland, where dreams come true." Someone had spray-painted nightmares over dreams in dripping red letters. My hands trembled slightly as I set up my sleeping area in the van's cargo space. Not from fear, not yet, but from anticipation. Urban exploration photography was my side passion, and abandoned amusement parks were the holy grail. The morning's golden hour would transform this decaying wonderland into something hauntingly beautiful. I just needed to wait until dawn. The van's interior felt smaller than it should have as darkness pressed against the windows. I tried to settle into my sleeping bag, but my eyes kept darting to the side mirror where the Ferris wheel loomed against the starless sky. Even in the darkness, I could make out its skeletal frame, the gondolas hanging like dead fruit from metal branches. That's when I heard it, a slow, grinding creak of metal on metal. My breath caught in my throat. Wind, I told myself. Just wind moving old machinery. But the air outside was perfectly still. I pressed my face against the window, my breath fogging the glass, and watched as one of the Ferris wheel gondolas swayed gently, then another. Then they all began to move in a slow, hypnotic rotation. The wheel was turning. My heart hammered against my ribs as I fumbled for my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the impossible sight. The Ferris wheel, which should have been frozen by years of rust and neglect, was rotating with deliberate purpose. Each gondola passed by my position with a rhythmic precision that made my skin crawl. Then the speakers crackled to life. The sound made me jump, my head cracking against the van's ceiling. Static hissed from multiple points around the park, a chorus of white noise that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. My mouth went dry as the static resolved into something worse, breathing, heavy, labored breathing that echoed my own panicked gasps. Marcus. The voice that emerged from the speakers was mine, not similar to mine. It was mine, captured and played back with perfect clarity despite coming from equipment that should have been dead for nearly 2 decades. "Marcus, it's time for the last ride." I scrambled for the van's keys, my fingers suddenly numb and clumsy. The engine wouldn't turn over. Once, twice, 3 times I twisted the key, each failed attempt accompanied by that horrible clicking sound of a dead battery. How was that possible? I'd driven here just hours ago. The speakers continued their assault, my own voice growing more insistent, more demanding. It repeated my name over and over, each iteration slightly distorted, as if the recording was degrading in real time. The Ferris wheel picked up speed, its gondolas now swinging wildly as they completed their circuits. I abandoned the van, stumbling out into the plaza. The concrete felt unstable beneath my feet, as if the ground itself was tilting. My flashlight beam swung wildly, catching glimpses of the park's decay. Game booths with prizes still hanging behind broken glass, a carousel with horses frozen mid-gallop, their painted eyes seeming to track my movement. The voice from the speakers grew louder, more aggressive. It wasn't just coming from the old PA system anymore. It emanated from the ticket booths, from the funhouse, from the very air itself. My name became a chant, a demand, a threat. I ran toward the midway, desperate to put distance between myself and that spinning wheel. My breath came in ragged gasps, each inhalation burning my lungs. Sweat poured down my face despite the cool night air, stinging my eyes and blurring my vision. The game's pavilion stretched before me, a tunnel of shadows and broken dreams. Prize wheels hung at impossible angles, their pegs clicking in rhythm with my thundering heartbeat. Stuffed animals watched from behind shattered glass, their button eyes reflecting my flashlight beam like tiny spotlights. Something moved in my peripheral vision. I spun around, the flashlight beam catching nothing but empty air. But I could feel it. A presence just beyond the edge of perception, matching my pace, herding me deeper into the park. The funhouse loomed ahead, its entrance a gaping maw filled with broken mirrors. I had no intention of entering, but my feet carried me forward anyway, as if the path itself was guiding me. The mirrors reflected fractured versions of myself, too many eyes, limbs that bent at wrong angles, a mouth that screamed silently. Inside, the mirrors created an endless maze of reflections. My flashlight beam bounced from surface to surface, creating a disorienting strobe effect. In some mirrors, I saw myself as I was, terrified, sweating, on the edge of panic. In others, I saw myself riding the Ferris wheel, my face blank and eyes empty. In one horrible reflection, I saw myself standing behind myself, reaching out with hands that weren't quite right. The speakers here were different. They whispered now, my voice soft and coaxing. They promised that the ride would be peaceful, that I'd finally understand, that all I had to do was return to the wheel and take my seat. The words wormed into my brain, each repetition making more sense than the last. I stumbled out of the funhouse through an emergency exit, gasping in the night air like a drowning man breaking the surface. My legs shook with exhaustion, muscles cramping from tension and fear. But the Ferris wheel still turned, now glowing with lights that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist. Each gondola was illuminated from within by a sickly yellow radiance. The ground between me and the wheel seemed to compress, space folding in on itself until I stood at its base without remembering the journey. Up close, I could see that the gondolas weren't empty. In each one sat a figure, transparent and flickering like old film footage. They wore outdated clothes, 70s styles, 80s fashions, 90s grunge. Their mouths moved in unison, speaking my name. One gondola remained empty, its door hanging open in invitation. The speakers roared back to life, my voice now screaming, demanding, pleading. It told me things I didn't want to know, couldn't know. It spoke of the others who had come here seeking photographs, seeking thrills, seeking something they couldn't name. It told me how they'd resisted at first, how they'd run and hidden and fought against the inevitable. It told me how peaceful they were now, riding forever in the gentle arc of the wheel. My hands moved without my permission, reaching for the gondola's door. Some part of me, a very small, very quiet part, screamed in protest. But the larger part, the part that had been listening to my own voice for what felt like hours, wanted nothing more than to climb inside and rest. The metal was cold under my fingers, real in a way that nothing else in this nightmare had been. I lifted one foot, ready to step inside, ready to join the eternal ride. Then I saw it, my reflection in the gondola's window. But it wasn't me. It was someone else wearing my face. Someone who had been here far longer than one night. Someone whose eyes held the flat, dead look of surrender. The shock broke whatever spell had been woven around me. I jerked backward, stumbling and falling hard on the concrete. Pain shot through my palms where they scraped against the ground, and that pain was beautiful because it was real, because it was mine. I ran, not with any direction or purpose, just away. Away from the wheel, away from the voices, away from whatever thing wore my face and spoke with my voice. The park seemed to fight my escape, paths doubling back on themselves, exits becoming dead ends. But adrenaline and terror are powerful motivators. I crashed through a maintenance fence, tearing my jacket on chain link. I stumbled through overgrown lots, branches tearing at my face and hands. Behind me, the speakers screamed my name in a voice that was no longer recognizably human. I found my van by accident more than design, nearly colliding with its side in my blind flight. This time, the engine roared to life on the first try. I didn't question it, didn't think about the impossibility. I just drove, tires squealing as I fishtailed out of the plaza. In the rearview mirror, the Ferris wheel still turned, every gondola now blazing with that sick yellow light. For just a moment, I could swear I saw myself in that empty gondola, waving goodbye to my own retreating taillights. I drove until dawn, until the sun burned away the night's impossibilities. I pulled over at a rest stop 50 miles away, my hands still shaking too badly to hold the wheel steady. In the harsh morning light, I could almost convince myself it had been a hallucination, a nightmare brought on by exhaustion and isolation. Almost. Because when I checked my camera bag, I found pictures I didn't remember taking. Dozens of them, all showing the same subject from different angles and distances. Me, standing at the base of the Ferris wheel, climbing into an empty gondola, sitting peacefully as it carried me up into the darkness, smiling at the camera with eyes that weren't my own. The timestamp on the photos showed they were taken 3 hours after I'd fled the park. I deleted the images, but they keep returning. Every morning, I find them on my camera, on my phone, printed and slipped under my apartment door. Each set shows me riding a little longer, my face a little more peaceful, a little less human. The worst part is the voice. Not from speakers now, but from inside my own head. My voice, patient and persistent, reminding me that the wheel is still turning, that my gondola is still empty, that sooner or later everyone takes their last ride. I've moved 3 times, changed my name, destroyed every piece of photography equipment I own. But still, I dream of the wheel. Still, I wake with the taste of rust in my mouth and the feeling of cold metal under my fingers. Sometimes in the small hours before dawn, I find myself in my car with no memory of getting there. The GPS is always set to the same destination, the same abandoned park where dreams became nightmares and the wheel never stops turning. One day I know I'll complete that drive. One day the voice will win, and I'll take my seat in that empty gondola. One day I'll join the others in their eternal revolution, another ghost in the machine, another voice calling out to the next photographer who thinks an abandoned amusement park would make the perfect subject. The wheel is patient. The wheel is certain. The wheel is waiting. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in a voice that sounds exactly like my own, I'm beginning to think that might not be such a bad thing after all. Story 2. The port never sleeps, but at 3 a.m. it dreams nightmares. I've worked the night shift as a crane operator for 12 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the darkness could offer. Drunk longshoremen stumbling between containers, rats the size of house cats scurrying through the shadows, the occasional body dumped by whoever needed the ocean to keep their secrets. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what waited inside container MSKU 7749823. My name is Marcus Reeves, and what I'm about to tell you happened 3 nights ago. I haven't slept since. Every time I close my eyes, I hear those whispers. Feel that impossible cold. See that metal box trembling like something alive. The shift started like any other. I climbed the narrow ladder to my crane cab, 60 feet above the concrete, my thermos of black coffee already half empty. The port stretched out below me like a vast cemetery of steel rectangles, each container a potential coffin waiting to be moved. Floodlights carved harsh circles in the darkness, leaving everything else to drown in shadow. I settled into my worn seat, cracked vinyl releasing the familiar squeak that had become my nightly greeting. The radio crackled, dispatch telling me to start with row G, stack 4, routine moves, nothing special. I fired up the spreader and got to work, the mechanical rhythm of lift swing lower becoming almost meditative. It was around 1 a.m. when I first noticed something wrong. The container sat at the edge of the yard, separated from the others by at least 20 feet of empty space. That alone was unusual. Space is money at a port, and we packed them tight. But what made my skin prickle was the frost. In the middle of August, with the temperature still hovering around 75 degrees even at night, this container was covered in a thick layer of ice. Steam, no, not steam, something denser and colder, rolled off its surface in slow, hypnotic waves. I rubbed my eyes, blinked hard. The frost remained. My supervisor's voice burst through the radio static, making me jump. He wanted to know why I'd stopped working. I told him I needed to check something, climbed down from the cab despite his protests. The closer I got to MSKU 7749823, the colder it became. By the time I stood 10 feet away, I could see my breath misting in the air. My arms erupted in goosebumps beneath my work shirt. The industrial floodlights overhead seemed to dim around this particular container, as if the darkness emanating from it was somehow thicker, more substantial than regular shadow. I should have walked away, should have reported it and let someone else deal with whatever was inside. But curiosity, that damned human curse, pulled me closer. The metal surface was covered in a spider web of frost patterns, beautiful and terrifying in their complexity. As I watched, they seemed to shift and writhe, forming shapes that almost looked like faces pressing against the inside of the container, mouths open in silent screams. Then I heard it, a sound that made my heart stutter. Thump, thump, exactly matching my heartbeat. Thump, thump. I pressed my ear against the frozen metal, ignoring the burning cold against my skin. The rhythm continued, perfectly synchronized with the blood pounding in my ears. But underneath it, barely audible, came something else. Whispers. Not in English, not in Spanish or Mandarin or any of the dozen languages you hear at the port. These were older sounds, guttural and wet, like someone trying to speak through a throat full of seawater. Yet somehow, impossibly, I understood them. They were asking for passage to land. I jerked back, my ear numb from the cold, leaving a perfect imprint in the frost. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Now I could make out individual voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all pleading in their ancient tongues. The container began to vibrate, a low thrumming that I felt in my bones. My radio exploded with static and garbled voices. Through the chaos, I heard my supervisor demanding to know what the hell I was doing. I tried to respond, but the words stuck in my throat like fish bones. My hands shook as I fumbled with the radio, finally managing to croak out that I was heading back to the crane. But I didn't move. Couldn't move. The whispers had hooks in my mind now, pulling me closer. The container's doors faced me, secured with a heavy-duty padlock that looked newer than the rest of the weathered metal. As I stared at it, frost began forming on the lock, spreading like an infection. The metal groaned and creaked. The padlock shattered. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet night, sending me stumbling backward. The doors remained closed, but now they bulged outward rhythmically, as if something massive was breathing inside. Thump, 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 thump. Still matching my heartbeat. Or was my heartbeat matching it? I became aware of other changes. The air tasted different, salty and old, like breathing inside a sunken ship. The floodlights flickered in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, and the ground beneath my feet felt wrong, too soft, as if the concrete was gradually turning to wet sand. The whispers changed, became more focused. Now they spoke directly to me, using my name. They knew things, memories I'd buried, fears I'd never voiced. They promised to take those burdens away if I just opened the doors. All they needed was passage to land. My feet moved without my permission, carrying me toward the container. My hands reached for the door handles. The metal was so cold it burned, but I couldn't let go. Behind the steel, something massive shifted and pressed against the doors. That's when I saw them, the other crane operators. Johnson from the day shift, Martinez, who'd retired last year, Chen, who died in an accident 3 months ago. They stood in a semicircle around the container, their eyes reflecting the strange blue-white glow emanating from the frost. Their mouths moved in unison with the whispers. Chen stepped forward, and I could see straight through him to the container behind. He told me, not with words but somehow directly into my mind, that they'd all heard the calling. They'd all provided passage. Now it was my turn. The doors began to open. What I saw inside defied every law of physics and sanity I'd ever known. The container's interior stretched impossibly far, a tunnel of ice and darkness that seemed to go on for miles. The walls pulsed like the inside of a throat, and floating in that impossible space were things that might once have been human, but were now something else entirely. They drifted like jellyfish in black water, their bodies translucent and wrong, trailing tendrils of frozen mist. One of them turned toward me, and where its face should have been was a void filled with stars. Not our stars, but alien constellations that hurt to perceive. It reached out with too many arms, each one ending in fingers that branched and rebranched like frozen fractals. The whispers became a roar. Passage to land, passage to land, passage to land. I understood then. They weren't asking to come ashore. They were asking me to provide passage, to become a vessel, a bridge between their realm and ours. The other operators hadn't died or retired. They'd been hollowed out and filled with something else, walking shells that served as doorways. My hand was on the door, pulling it wider. The cold had spread up my arm, turning my skin translucent. I could see my veins darkening, filling with something that moved with its own purpose. In moments, I would step inside and become another door, another passage. But then I heard it. A sound that cut through the supernatural cold like a blade of pure heat. My daughter's laugh. Not really her, of course. She lived 2 states away and hadn't laughed like that since she was 5. But the memory of that sound, bright and alive and utterly human, gave me just enough strength to remember who I was, what I was. I was Marcus Reeves. I was human. I was warm and breathing and alive. And I would not become a doorway for these things. I wrenched my hand away from the door, leaving skin behind on the frozen metal. The pain was incredible, white-hot agony that cleared the fog from my mind. The ghostly operators flickered, their faces twisting in rage. The whispers became shrieks that made my ears bleed. I ran. Behind me, the container doors slammed shut with a sound like thunder. The ground cracked and split, concrete crumbling as something vast tried to force its way through. The other operators, the hollow ones, pursued me with movements that were wrong, too fluid, as if they were swimming through the air. I reached my crane and climbed faster than I'd ever climbed before, my frozen hand leaving bloody prints on each rung. The cab had always been my sanctuary, my castle in the sky, and I prayed it would protect me now. As soon as I sealed the door, the temperature normalized. The whispers faded to distant echoes. Through the cab windows, I watched the hollow operators circle the base of the crane like sharks, their forms becoming less solid with each pass until they finally dissolved into mist. The container sat innocently in its spot, no trace of frost or impossible cold, just another steel box among thousands. I called in sick for the rest of my shift. Told my supervisor I'd gotten food poisoning, my voice shaky enough to sell the lie. He grumbled but didn't push. I drove home as the sun rose, my damaged hand throbbing in time with my racing heart. For the next 2 days, I researched. I dug through port records, shipping manifests, old newspapers. MSKU 7749823 didn't exist in any database. But I found other things. Reports of crane operators going missing over the decades. Stories of containers that arrived without documentation and disappeared just as mysteriously. Whispers of things in the deep ocean that should never reach land. Last night I returned to work. I had bills to pay, and I'd convinced myself that staying away from row G would be enough. I was wrong. The container had moved. Now it sat directly in my assigned section, frost already forming on its surface despite the security cameras that showed nothing unusual. My supervisor's manifest showed it scheduled for loading onto a ship bound for Portland. I refused, made up excuses, said my crane had mechanical problems, but I knew it was only a matter of time. The whispers had started again, faint but growing stronger. My hand, the one that had touched the door, had begun to turn translucent at the fingertips. They're patient, these things from the deep. They've waited in the dark water for eons. They can wait a little longer, but they will have their passage to land, if not through me, then through another operator, another port, another soul willing to open doors that should remain closed. I'm writing this as a warning. If you work the night shift at any port, if you see a container covered in impossible frost, if you hear whispers in ancient languages asking for passage, run. Don't let curiosity pull you close. Don't listen to the voices that know your name. And whatever you do, never touch the doors. Because once you provide passage, even for a moment, part of you stays in that impossible space inside the container. Part of you drifts in the dark water between stars, whispering to the next fool who gets too close. I can feel it happening to me. Each night, I fade a little more. My reflection grows dimmer. My thoughts echo with alien tides. Soon, I'll be standing with the others around some other container in some other port, my hollow eyes reflecting that cold blue light, my mouth moving in unison with the ancient chorus. Passage to land. Passage to land. Passage to land. The port never sleeps. And now neither do I. Story 3. And the mountain doesn't forgive. That's what the locals whispered when I asked about the unmarked trail leading up to the thermal springs. Their weathered faces turning away, as if the very mention summoned something better left undisturbed. But I needed silence more than their warnings. The city had been choking me with its endless noise, suffocating me with deadlines and expectations until my chest felt like it might cave in. The Andes promised solitude, and I was desperate enough to take it. The climb took 6 hours through terrain that seemed designed to break both body and spirit. My lungs burned in the thin air as I followed the barely visible path carved into the mountainside. Each step sent loose stones tumbling into the abyss below, their echoes swallowed by the vast emptiness surrounding me. The silence up here wasn't peaceful. It was aggressive, pressing against my eardrums with an intensity that made me question whether I'd gone deaf. When I finally reached the springs, the sight should have been breathtaking. Instead, it felt wrong. The water bubbled up from deep underground, forming a natural pool about 20 feet across, ringed by ancient stone formations that looked like gnarled fingers reaching toward the sky. Steam rose from the surface in lazy spirals, but there was no sound. Not the gentle bubbling you'd expect from boiling water, not even the whisper of wind through the rocks. The silence was so complete it felt solid, like walking into a wall of cotton. I set up my small camp on a flat outcropping nearby, my hands shaking slightly as I assembled the tent. The altitude, I told myself. Just the altitude making me jittery. But my heart hammered against my ribs with a rhythm that had nothing to do with thin air, and when I looked at the springs, my skin crawled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The water temperature felt perfect when I tested it with my hand, hot enough to ease the knots in my shoulders, but not scalding. I stripped down to my shorts, my skin prickling in the mountain air. The silence pressed closer as I approached the edge, so thick I could almost taste it. My reflection stared back from the dark water, distorted by the gentle undulations of the surface, and for a moment, it looked like someone else entirely. Someone with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted in silent screaming. I blinked hard, and the image returned to normal. Stress hallucinations. My doctor had warned me about them during my last breakdown. Too much pressure, too little sleep, too many stimulants keeping me functional when my body wanted to collapse. This trip was supposed to fix all that. The first step into the water sent warmth shooting up my leg, a blessed relief after the cold mountain air. I waded deeper, my muscles beginning to unknot as the heat seeped into my bones. The silence grew heavier, more oppressive, as if the water itself was absorbing sound. I couldn't even hear my own breathing. That's when I felt the first touch. Something brushed against my ankle, just a whisper of contact that could have been a current or a piece of debris. But the water in this pool had nowhere to flow, and there was nothing visible beneath the surface. My heart rate spiked, sending adrenaline flooding through my system. I stood perfectly still, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that the stress and isolation were making me paranoid. The second touch was unmistakable. Fingers. Cold, despite the boiling water around them, wrapping around my ankle with the deliberate pressure of intent. My entire body went rigid, every muscle locking up as if I'd been electrocuted. The grip tightened, and I felt myself being pulled downward with surprising strength. I tried to scream, but no sound emerged. The oppressive silence had somehow invaded my throat, stealing my voice along with everything else. Panic flooded my system as I struggled against the grip, my arms flailing uselessly at the water's surface. Whatever held me was incredibly strong, and with each passing second, I sank deeper into the thermal pool. The water closed over my head, and that's when the visions began. They slammed into my consciousness like physical blows, each image more vivid and terrifying than anything I'd ever experienced. I saw a woman in hiking gear, her face blue with oxygen deprivation, clawing desperately at rocks that crumbled beneath her fingers. She'd been trying to climb down from the springs for days, but every path led back to the water, as if the mountain itself was herding her toward some inevitable fate. Another vision, a man in expensive outdoor gear, his designer backpack torn and muddy, sitting beside the pool with his head in his hands. He'd been crying for hours, though no tears fell from his eyes. The silence had stolen even that small comfort. He kept checking his satellite phone, pressing buttons frantically, but the screen remained black. Not broken, simply refused to acknowledge the outside world existed. More images flooded through me, dozens of them, all showing the same pattern. People who'd found this place seeking solitude, seeking escape, only to discover they could never leave. Some had been here for weeks, others for months, all of them slowly losing pieces of themselves to the hungry silence that fed on human presence. The grip on my ankle loosened, and I shot to the surface, gasping for air that tasted of sulfur and desperation. My hands shook violently as I hauled myself onto the stone ledge, water streaming from my hair and clothes. The silence pressed against me with renewed intensity, and I realized with growing horror that I could no longer hear my own heartbeat. The sound had been there my entire life, a constant companion I'd never noticed until it vanished. I stumbled back to my camp, my legs barely supporting my weight. Every instinct screamed at me to pack up and run. But when I looked at the trail leading down the mountain, it seemed to twist and writhe like a living thing. The path I'd climbed just hours earlier was gone, replaced by a maze of false routes that led nowhere but back to the springs. Night fell with unnatural speed, and the darkness that settled over the mountain was absolute. No stars, no moon, no distant lights from civilization, just an endless black void that seemed to pulse with malevolent awareness. I huddled in my tent, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps that I couldn't hear but could feel burning my lungs. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, the visions returned. More people trapped on this cursed peak, all of them drawn by the same promise of peace I'd been chasing. They wandered the mountainside like ghosts, forever seeking an escape route that didn't exist, their voices stolen by the same silence that now claimed mine. By morning, if it even was morning in this place where time seemed negotiable, I'd made a decision. I couldn't descend the way I'd come. That much was clear. But there had to be another way. There was always another way. I packed my gear with trembling hands, every movement feeling sluggish and wrong in the oppressive quiet. The springs bubbled silently behind me, and I swore I could feel eyes watching from beneath the surface. Those cold fingers, waiting for me to return, waiting for me to accept what I was slowly beginning to understand. The mountain didn't just trap people physically. It fed on their desperation, their need for escape, until they became part of its ecosystem. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of voices that had been devoured, experiences that had been consumed, souls that had been processed into something else entirely. I started walking anyway, following what looked like a game trail along the ridge. My legs felt heavy, as if I was wading through invisible water, and my vision kept blurring at the edges. The lack of sound was driving me insane, not just the absence of noise, but the presence of something worse, a quality to the silence that suggested it was alive, breathing, thinking. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost all meaning in this place where the sun hung motionless in a gray sky. I found myself back at the springs 3 times, approaching from different directions each time, as if the mountain was playing a cruel joke. The water bubbled with that same soundless fury, steam rising in patterns that almost looked like faces. On my 4th attempt to leave, I encountered another hiker. He sat on a boulder overlooking the trail, his clothes torn and dirty, his beard grown long and unkempt. When he saw me, his mouth opened in what should have been a greeting, but no words emerged. He pointed frantically at his throat, then at his ears, his eyes wide with a terror I recognized all too well. Without sound, communication became a desperate pantomime. He showed me a notebook filled with increasingly frantic entries, the handwriting deteriorating from neat cursive to barely legible scrawl. The final entry, written in what looked like charcoal, simply read, "It's in the water, it's in the silence, it's in us now." I backed away from him, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong, and pointed toward the springs. His mouth moved in what I thought might be a warning, but could equally have been a plea, or an invitation. That's when I understood. The people I'd seen in the visions weren't victims. They were recruitment tools. Each person who found this place became part of its collection, another voice to add to the hungry silence, another set of hands to pull down the next traveler who thought they'd found sanctuary. I ran then, abandoning any pretense of dignity or plan. My boots slipped on loose scree as I careened down slopes that hadn't existed moments before, following paths that shifted and changed, even as I navigated them. The silence pursued me like a physical presence, reaching out with invisible tendrils that tried to wrap around my thoughts and drag me back. The thermal springs appeared ahead of me again, and I realized with dawning horror that I wasn't running away. I was being herded. Every route, every decision, every desperate attempt at escape led back to the same place, back to the water that boiled without sound, back to the hands that waited beneath the surface. I stopped at the edge of the pool, my chest heaving with exertion and terror. The water looked different now, darker, more viscous, as if it had thickened with the dissolved hopes of everyone who'd ever tried to leave. My reflection stared back at me, but now I could see the others behind it. Dozens of faces, all wearing the same expression of resigned despair. The silence pressed against me from all sides, and I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. Not my heart stopping, something worse. The sound of my own existence being slowly erased, absorbed into the vast quiet that ruled this place. I understood then that escape wasn't about finding the right path or outsmarting the mountain. It was about accepting what I'd become part of, embracing the silence that had already begun to hollow me out from the inside. The mountain didn't trap people. It transformed them. And transformation, I was learning, was irreversible. But as that realization settled into my bones like cold water, I felt something else. A tiny spark of defiance, buried deep beneath the terror and despair. I might not be able to leave this place, but I didn't have to surrender completely. I could choose how much of myself to give up, and how much to keep locked away where even the hungry silence couldn't reach. I backed away from the springs one final time, not to escape, but to find a place where I could make my stand. A place where I could wait, and watch, and perhaps, when the next traveler arrived seeking solitude, find a way to warn them that some silences are too deep to ever crawl out of. The mountain watched me settle into my new role, patient as stone, quiet as the grave. And in that silence, I began to plan. Story 4. The sand wasn't supposed to sing. I'd been tracking across the Jalapões golden dunes for 3 days when I first heard it, a low, trembling hum that seemed to rise from beneath my hiking boots. At first I dismissed it as wind cutting through the formations, maybe some geological quirk I'd never encountered before. But winds don't harmonize. Winds don't crescendo with each step you take deeper into their domain. My name is Marcus, and I came to Brazil's Cerrado seeking solitude after my divorce finalized. What better place to disappear than one of the most remote wilderness areas on the continent? The Jalapões' vast landscapes of orange dunes, crystal rivers, and endless sky had promised the kind of isolation I craved. I'd planned a week-long solo trek, carrying enough supplies to sustain myself while I worked through the wreckage of my former life. But by the fourth morning, as I crested a particularly steep dune, the humming had evolved into something unmistakably melodic. Multiple voices, if that's what they could be called, weaving together in harmonies that made my skin crawl. The sound seemed to emanate from the sand itself, vibrating up through the soles of my feet and into my bones. I stopped walking. The chorus stopped too. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stood frozen on the dune's peak, scanning the undulating landscape for any sign of other people. But there was nothing. Just endless waves of golden sand stretching to the horizon, punctuated by scattered patches of scrub vegetation and the occasional stunted tree. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, already approaching the scorching intensity that would make midday travel nearly impossible. When I took another step forward, the singing resumed immediately, a shade louder than before. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead despite the heat. I'd read about auditory hallucinations brought on by extreme isolation and dehydration, but I'd been careful with my water intake. My lips weren't cracked. My urine was still relatively clear. This wasn't desert madness. At least I didn't think it was. I forced myself to continue walking, each footfall producing that eerie melodic response from below. The voices, and I was certain now they were voices, however impossible that seemed, followed complex harmonic progressions that seemed almost liturgical. Like a church choir buried beneath tons of sand, still singing their eternal hymns. The sensation of being watched crept over me as I descended into a valley between two massive dunes. My peripheral vision kept catching movement that vanished when I turned to look directly. Shadows shifting against the wind's direction. Dark shapes that could have been rocks or vegetation, but seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. By noon, the heat forced me to seek shelter. I erected my small tent in the lee of a dune and crawled inside, grateful for even the minimal shade it provided. But even here, pressed against the sand with only a thin layer of fabric between us, I could feel the vibrations. The singing had grown more complex, more insistent. Individual voices were becoming distinct within the chorus, a deep bass line, soaring soprano melodies, intricate harmonies that made my teeth ache. I tried to sleep but kept jerking awake, convinced I'd heard my name woven into the wordless songs. The rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible, but rationality felt increasingly fragile out here where the horizon shimmered with heat mirages, and the very ground beneath me had apparently found its voice. When the sun began its descent toward the western dunes, I broke camp and continued south toward my planned exit point. But with each step, the singing grew more urgent, more beautiful, more terrifying. The harmonies were ascending now, climbing scale by scale toward some crescendo that made my nerve endings sing in sympathetic resonance. That's when I saw the first face. It emerged from the sand just ahead of my right foot as I crested another dune, features molded from grains of quartz and feldspar, eyes that were deeper shadows in the shifting surface. The mouth moved as if forming words, though the only sound was that eternal chorus growing ever more complex around me. I stumbled backward, my pack throwing me off balance. More faces appeared where my feet had been, expressions of profound longing etched in the malleable sand. They seemed to be reaching upward, trying to break free of their granular prison. The singing was definitely louder now, no longer a hum, but a full-throated chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And underneath the melody, I could swear I heard whispered words in a language I didn't recognize, syllables that felt ancient and wrong in my mouth when I tried to repeat them. "Stay," the faces seemed to be saying, though their lips moved in patterns that didn't match any human language. "Learn the song. Learn the whole song." Panic flooded my system with adrenaline. My hands shook as I fumbled for my GPS unit, desperate to confirm my location and plot the fastest route out of this place. But the screen showed only static, the satellite signal apparently blocked by some invisible interference. I ran. The sand erupted beneath my feet with each pounding step, faces blooming like deadly flowers in my wake. The chorus exploded into a symphony now, dozens of voices climbing toward notes that human ears weren't meant to process. My backpack bounced painfully against my spine as I half slid, half tumbled down the dune's face, but I didn't dare slow down. Behind me, the singing reached a pitch that made my vision blur. The very air seemed to thicken, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. More faces emerged from the sand around me, no longer confined to my footprints but spreading outward in concentric circles, each one mouthing the same silent plea. The whole song, they seemed to say. Stay and learn the whole song. My lungs burned as I crested another dune, legs shaking with exhaustion. But ahead, impossibly, was another valley filled with even more faces, a congregation of sand-carved worshippers all turning toward me with empty, yearning eyes. The chorus swelled to orchestral proportions, harmonies so complex they seemed to bend the laws of acoustics. I realized with growing horror that I wasn't escaping at all. Each step forward, each desperate attempt to flee, was somehow drawing me deeper into whatever this was. The faces were becoming more detailed, more expressive. Some seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen them before. Others looked like crude sketches of faces I'd known and lost. Childhood friends, deceased relatives, my ex-wife's mother who'd always disapproved of me. The singing was inside my head now, resonating in my skull cavity like the world's most beautiful torture device. I pressed my palms against my ears, but it made no difference. The melody was coming from within, as if my own bones had joined the chorus. Night fell with tropical suddenness, but the faces in the sand began to glow with their own phosphorescent light. Bioluminescence, my rational mind insisted. Just some kind of microorganism activated by my footfalls. But organisms don't arrange themselves into human features, don't maintain eye contact as you stumble past them in the darkness. I'd lost all sense of direction. The stars wheeled overhead in unfamiliar configurations, and my compass needle spun lazily without settling on any particular bearing. The only constant was the singing, the faces, and the growing certainty that something vast and patient was drawing me toward its center. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed as fluid as the sand beneath my feet. I found myself walking in rhythm with the chorus, my steps matching the meter of their impossible song. Part of me recognized this as a dangerous development, but a larger part was beginning to understand the beauty of what I was hearing. The mathematical precision of the harmonies, the way each voice supported and elevated the others in perfect acoustic architecture. When dawn finally broke, I discovered I'd been walking in a vast spiral, my GPS track describing a perfect logarithmic curve centered on a depression between three towering dunes. At the spiral's heart, the sand had formed itself into an amphitheater of faces, thousands of them arranged in concentric circles, like the world's most impossible choir. They were all looking at me, all mouthing the same silent words. Stay and learn the song, the whole song. The music reached a crescendo that should have shattered my eardrums, but instead filled me with a euphoria I'd never experienced. Every cell in my body vibrated in harmony with the chorus, and for one terrifying moment I understood what they were asking. This wasn't madness or hallucination. This was an invitation to join something eternal, something beautiful beyond human comprehension. The song had gaps in it, spaces where my voice was meant to fit. I could feel the melody pulling at my vocal cords, demanding completion. All I had to do was open my mouth and sing along, and I would understand everything. The faces would welcome me, the sand would embrace me, and I would never be alone again. My lips parted. The first note built in my throat. But something in me, some stubborn human defiance, some desperate clinging to my own identity, made me bite down hard on my tongue instead. Pain flooded my mouth with the taste of copper, shocking me back into something resembling rational thought. I turned and ran, not toward any exit or destination, just away from the amphitheater of faces and their seductive harmonies. The chorus followed me, growing more urgent, more beautiful, more devastating with each step. But I kept running, kept biting my tongue whenever I felt the urge to join their song. The sun climbed higher, my water ran out. Heat mirages danced around me like wraiths, and the faces in the sand began to look more desperate, more pleading. But gradually, incrementally, the singing began to fade. By late afternoon, as I stumbled out of the dune field and onto the relatively solid ground of the Cerrado proper, the chorus had diminished to a distant whisper. The faces still appeared occasionally in patches of loose sand, but they seemed smaller now, less distinct, less real. I didn't stop walking until I reached the highway 2 days later, dehydrated and sunburned but undeniably human. The rangers who picked me up attributed my condition to heat exhaustion and mild hallucinations brought on by isolation. I let them believe that explanation because the alternative was impossible to convey. But sometimes, late at night in my apartment back in São Paulo, I can still hear echoes of that chorus. Fragments of the song that wanted to complete itself through me. And part of me, a part that grows stronger each day, wonders what would have happened if I'd stayed just a little longer. If I'd learned just one more verse. The sand remembers, and it's still singing, waiting patiently for someone to help it finish its eternal song. Someone braver than I was. Someone willing to become part of something larger, more beautiful, and infinitely more terrifying than any single human voice could ever be. I should forget. I should let the experience fade into the category of trauma-induced delusion where it belongs. But I find myself researching flights back to Brazil, studying maps of the Jalapão, planning another trek into those singing dunes. Because deep down, in a place I don't want to acknowledge, I know the truth. The song isn't finished, and neither am I. Story 5. The fluorescent lights in Estação da Luz flickered with a dying rhythm that matched my exhausted heartbeat. Something felt wrong from the moment I descended those concrete steps, but exhaustion had dulled my instincts to whisper thin warnings I chose to ignore. The digital clock above the platform read 11:47 p.m. when I finally reached the subway station. My shift at the accounting firm had stretched past midnight again, leaving me among the dregs of São Paulo's night commuters. The few remaining passengers looked as hollow-eyed as I felt, their faces illuminated intermittently by the stuttering overhead lights that cast everything in a sickly yellow pallor. My phone showed no signal down here, which wasn't unusual, but something about the silence felt different tonight. Usually, even at this hour, you could hear the distant rumble of trains moving through other tunnels, the electronic announcements echoing from adjacent platforms. Tonight, there was only the oppressive weight of concrete and steel pressing down from above, and the occasional drip of water falling from unseen cracks in the ceiling. When the train finally arrived, its headlight cutting through the murky tunnel like a searchlight, I noticed it seemed older than the usual fleet. The blue and white paint job looked faded, almost sepia-toned under the platform lights. But fatigue made me careless about details. I just wanted to get home. The doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss that sounded more labored than usual. Only 3 other passengers sat scattered throughout the car, each staring at nothing with the glazed expression of the terminally tired. I claimed a seat near the middle, my reflection ghostly in the window as the train pulled away from the platform. The first indication that something was wrong came after what should have been Estação República. I'd made this journey hundreds of times, knew every stop, every curve in the track. But the announcements weren't coming, and the stations we passed looked different, older. The tile work seemed more weathered, the lighting dimmer and more orange than the bright white LEDs I was accustomed to. My heart began a slow, steady climb toward my throat as I tried to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew. The woman across from me hadn't moved since I'd boarded. Neither had the man in the business suit near the door, or the teenager with the worn leather jacket at the far end of the car. They sat like mannequins, perfectly still, their breathing so shallow I had to strain to detect the rise and fall of their chests. The train began to slow, and I felt that familiar sensation of brakes engaging, but there should have been no stop here. According to my mental map, we were traveling through a section of tunnel that ran uninterrupted for several kilometers. Yet ahead, I could see the glow of platform lights approaching. When we finally stopped, the doors opened onto a station I had never seen before. The platform stretched away in both directions, far longer than any station I knew on this line. The walls were covered in white tiles, but not the crisp, modern white of recent renovations. These tiles had the slightly cream-colored patina of age, and many were cracked or missing entirely. The lighting came from incandescent bulbs housed in fixtures that looked like they belonged in another era. But it was the advertisements that made my blood run cold. Every poster, every billboard, every advertisement visible on the platform walls showed products and styles from decades past. A woman in a paisley dress smiled at me from a cigarette advertisement, her hair in the voluminous style I'd seen in my mother's old photo albums. Next to it, a man with thick sideburns promoted a brand of television I'd never heard of. The typography, the color schemes, the photographic quality, everything screamed 1974. My mouth went dry as I stepped off the train, my legs unsteady beneath me. The platform felt solid enough, real enough, but the air carried a staleness that made me think of sealed rooms and forgotten places. Behind me, I heard the train doors slide shut, followed by the familiar acceleration whine of electric motors. But when I turned to watch it disappear into the tunnel, I saw something that made my knees nearly buckle. The tracks behind the train simply ended in darkness. Not the darkness of a tunnel extending beyond the reach of platform lights, but an absolute void that seemed to swallow light itself. And from that void came the continuous sound of the train I had just left. The rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails, the electric hum of motors, the occasional squeal of brakes, as if it were still there, still moving, but existing in some space I could no longer see or reach. I spun around, my breathing becoming shallow and rapid. The other passengers from the train were nowhere to be seen. The platform was completely empty except for me, stretching away into shadows that seemed to move and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. A bead of cold sweat traced its way down my spine as I approached one of the advertisement boards. The paper felt real under my fingertips, slightly rough and yellowed with age. The date in the corner of a newspaper stand poster confirmed my worst fear: 15 de Marzo, 1974. My heart hammered against my ribs as I tried to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. Stations didn't just appear and disappear. Time didn't work this way. But the evidence surrounded me, undeniable and wrong. I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the empty space, but received no response. The sound seemed to be absorbed by the walls themselves, muffled and distorted until it barely resembled human speech. When the echo finally faded, the silence that replaced it felt heavier than before, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. That's when I noticed the security cameras. They were the old dome-style cameras, mounted high on the walls, but they tracked my movement with too much precision, too much intelligence. As I walked along the platform, searching for an exit, each camera swiveled to follow me, their mechanical whirring barely audible but constant, like metallic breathing. The exit signs, when I finally found them, were written in a font style I didn't recognize, though the Portuguese was clear enough. But the corridors they indicated led only to more empty passages, more walls covered in those time-displaced advertisements, more intersections that branched into shadows. My palms were slick with perspiration now, my shirt clinging to my back despite the cool air. Each breath felt insufficient, as if the atmosphere here contained less oxygen than it should. I began to run, my footsteps echoing in a rhythm that seemed to multiply, creating the impression that I was being followed by invisible companions matching my pace. The deeper I went into this impossible station, the more distorted everything became. Corridors that should have led back to the platform instead curved away into darkness. Staircases that promised access to street level simply ended at blank walls. And everywhere, those cameras followed my progress with their unblinking mechanical eyes. In one particularly long hallway, I discovered a newsstand still fully stocked with magazines and newspapers, all dated from 1974. The vendor's chair sat empty behind the counter, but still warm when I pressed my palm against the seat cushion. A cup of coffee on the small table beside it was still steaming, though no one was anywhere to be seen. The magazines themselves were wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. The text was in Portuguese. The layout and design matched the era perfectly, but the stories they contained described events that hadn't happened. Political scandals involving people I'd never heard of, sports results from teams that didn't exist, weather reports for cities with impossible names. I grabbed one of the newspapers, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what I was reading. The front page featured a photograph of the very station I was standing in, but showing it bustling with commuters in 1970s attire. The headline read, Nova Estação Temporal Inaugurada, Portal para Viajantes do Futuro. The paper slipped from my numb fingers as the implications hit me. This wasn't just an abandoned station or some elaborate hoax. According to what I'd just read, this place had been designed specifically to trap people like me. People from the future who had somehow stepped outside their proper time. Behind me, I heard the sound of approaching footsteps, but when I spun around, the corridor was empty. The cameras had all turned to focus on the spot where I stood, their mechanical whirring growing louder, more insistent. That's when I understood that I wasn't alone here. The other passengers from the train, they hadn't disappeared. They were still here, somewhere in this maze of impossible architecture and temporal displacement. And based on the way those cameras tracked movement that I couldn't see, based on the footsteps that had no source, I began to suspect that there were many more people trapped here than just the handful I'd traveled with. People from different times, different decades, all caught in the same temporal snare. The realization made my chest tight with panic. How long had this place been operating? How many late-night commuters had taken that last train and found themselves deposited in this pocket of displaced time? Were they all still here, invisible to each other but present nonetheless, wandering these endless corridors forever? I pressed my back against the wall, feeling the cool tile through my shirt, and tried to control my breathing. There had to be a way out. The train had brought me here, so logic dictated that another train could take me back. But the tracks behind my arrival point had simply ended in void. As if responding to my thoughts, I heard it again, the distant sound of an approaching train. The rhythmic clacking grew louder, accompanied by the squeal of brakes engaging. My heart leaped with desperate hope as I ran back toward what I thought was the platform, following the sound through corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves as I moved through them. But when I finally emerged onto a platform, though whether it was the same one where I'd arrived, I couldn't be sure, the train that waited there was different, older still. The paint was more faded, the windows smaller, and through the glass I could see passengers dressed in clothing from an even earlier era. The doors opened with that same pneumatic hiss, but this time it sounded like a sigh, like something tired beyond measure finally giving up. I stood at the threshold, my entire body trembling with indecision. Getting on that train might take me further from home, deeper into whatever temporal maze this place represented. But staying meant accepting that I was trapped here forever, doomed to wander empty corridors while cameras tracked my movements and invisible footsteps echoed my own. In the end, it wasn't really a choice at all. I stepped aboard, and as the doors closed behind me, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. But the man looking back at me was wearing clothes I didn't recognize, his face older and more weathered than it should have been. The train began to move, carrying me deeper into the dark, while behind us, the platform lights faded until they were just another memory of a place that shouldn't exist. And in the distance, growing fainter but never quite disappearing, I could still hear the sound of that first train, the one that had brought me here, still running its eternal route through tunnels that existed outside of time. I closed my eyes and tried not to think about how many other versions of myself might already be riding these rails, all of us searching for a way home that might not exist anymore, if it ever had at all. Story 6. Some places wait for you long before you know they exist. They call to you through newspaper classifieds, through casual conversations with strangers, through the inexplicable pull of a photograph you stumble across online. The Hartwell farm had been calling to me for months before I finally answered. I told myself it was about the work. Night photography of sunflowers under a full moon, something no one had captured quite right before. The magazine would pay well for exclusive shots, and my portfolio needed the edge that only came from risk, from going where others wouldn't go. But as I pulled up the gravel driveway that October evening, watching the endless rows of towering sunflowers sway in perfect unison despite the still air, I felt something deeper than professional ambition stirring in my chest. something that made my hands tremble on the steering wheel. The farmhouse crouched between two massive oak trees, its windows dark despite the thin smoke curling from the chimney. Mrs. Hartwell had sounded normal enough on the phone when I'd called about accommodations, though she'd asked twice about my intentions for visiting. Now, stepping out of my car into the unnaturally quiet evening, I wondered if she'd been trying to warn me away. My camera bag felt heavier than usual as I approached the front door. The silence pressed against my eardrums with an almost physical weight. No insects chirped, no birds called from the trees. Even the wind had died to nothing. Just the soft whisper of sunflower stalks rubbing against each other in the vast field that stretched beyond the house to the horizon. Mrs. Hartwell answered my knock before I'd finished knocking. She was a small woman, maybe 60, with steel gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. She led me inside without small talk, her slippers making no sound on the worn wooden floors. The guest room was sparse but clean, with a single window facing the sunflower field. As she showed me around, Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that dinner would be ready at 7, and that I should be careful walking the property after dark. The way she said it made my skin crawl. Not a casual warning about uneven ground or farm equipment, but something urgent and specific that she wouldn't elaborate on when I asked. Dinner passed in near silence. The food was good, but I found myself struggling to swallow, my throat constricted by an anxiety I couldn't name. Mrs. Hartwell watched me eat with those penetrating eyes, occasionally nodding as if confirming something to herself. When I mentioned my plans to photograph the sunflowers at midnight, she set down her fork with deliberate care. She told me that the flowers behaved strangely during the full moon, that I might see things that would challenge my understanding of the natural world. She advised me to stay close to the house, to keep the porch light in sight at all times, and under no circumstances should I venture into the heart of the field. When I pressed for more details, she simply said that the farm had its own rhythms, its own needs, and that outsiders who respected those rhythms were welcome to stay. I retired to my room at 10, ostensibly to rest before my midnight shoot, but sleep was impossible. The silence outside was so complete, it made my ears ring. I lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to my own heartbeat, which seemed unnaturally loud in the dead air. At 11:30, I gave up on rest and began preparing my equipment. The camera gear felt foreign in my hands, despite years of experience. My fingers fumbled with familiar straps and settings, and I had to check my light meter 3 times before trusting the reading. Something about this place was affecting my equilibrium, making even simple tasks feel uncertain and strange. I slipped out of the house at 1:45, leaving through the back door to avoid disturbing Mrs. Hartwell. The porch light cast a weak yellow glow maybe 20 feet into the darkness, and beyond that, the world disappeared into absolute black. I'd brought a powerful flashlight, but when I clicked it on, the beam seemed to die just a few yards ahead, swallowed by the impenetrable night. The sunflowers loomed above me, their massive heads turned away from the house, facing east toward where the moon would rise. Even in the darkness, I could sense their presence, thousands upon thousands of them, standing silent and patient in perfect rows. The stalks were easily 8 feet tall, their leaves rustling with that same whispered sound I'd noticed earlier, though still no wind stirred the air around me. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked slowly into the field, following one of the narrow paths between the rows. The darkness seemed to pulse around me, and I found myself taking short, shallow breaths, as if the air itself had grown thick and resistant. Every few steps, I paused to look back at the house, reassuring myself that the porch light was still visible, still beckoning me back to safety. 20 feet into the field, my flashlight began to flicker. I shook it, checked the batteries I'd just installed, but the beam continued to weaken and pulse erratically. The darkness pressed closer, and I became acutely aware that I could no longer hear my own footsteps on the dirt path. The silence had become so complete that even sound seemed to be absorbed by the waiting sunflowers. At 5 minutes to midnight, the first change began. It started as a subtle shift in the air pressure, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. My ears popped, and suddenly I could hear my heart again, pounding so hard I was certain it could be heard for miles. The sunflower heads began to move, slowly, deliberately, turning in unison away from the east, toward me. I stood frozen, flashlight trembling in my grip, as thousands of massive flower faces swiveled to regard me with their dark centers. The movement was utterly silent, but I could feel it in my bones, a deep vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Row after row of towering flowers turned their attention to the small, warm figure standing among them. And I understood with primitive certainty that I was no longer alone. The moon crested the horizon exactly at midnight, full and brilliant white, casting the field in sharp silver relief. The sunflowers completed their turn in perfect synchronization, their faces now oriented toward the lunar disk, and I saw with growing horror what Mrs. Hartwell had tried to warn me about. The shadows cast by the flowers were wrong. Where each sunflower's shadow should have been the simple silhouette of stalk and bloom, instead I saw the unmistakable shapes of human figures. Men and women of various heights and builds, their shadow arms reaching toward me, their shadow heads turning to track my movement as I stumbled backward toward the house. But I wasn't moving backward anymore. I was standing perfectly still, yet the shadows continued to shift and reach, independent of their sources. And worse, my own shadow, cast by the moonlight streaming over my shoulder, was no longer attached to my feet. It stood several yards away, watching me with a posture of patient interest. That's when the voices began. The chorus started as a whisper, barely audible above the rush of blood in my ears. A dozen voices, then 50, then hundreds, all speaking in unison from somewhere deep within the field. They welcomed me to the cycle, invited me to join the eternal dance of seasons, promised me peace and purpose and belonging. The words seemed to come from the earth itself, resonating through my boots and up into my chest cavity, until I felt them vibrating in my teeth and skull. Welcome to the cycle. Welcome to the cycle. Welcome to the cycle. My legs began moving without my permission, carrying me deeper into the field. The shadow figures beckoned from every direction, their forms growing more detailed and defined with each step I took away from the house. I could see faces now, expressions of serene contentment, arms extended in greeting. My own detached shadow walked beside me, perfectly in step, occasionally reaching out as if to take my hand. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, but my body continued its involuntary march toward the heart of the field. I tried to turn around, to run back to the house, but my muscles ignored every command. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with dawning terror that other voices were joining the chorus. Fresh voices, recent voices, belonging to people who had once stood exactly where I now stood. 50 yards from the house, 100, 200. The porch light became a distant star, then disappeared entirely behind the wall of sunflower stalks. I was completely surrounded now, trapped in a living labyrinth of stems and shadows, all leading inexorably towards some central point I couldn't see but could feel pulling at me like a powerful magnet. My camera bounced against my chest as I walked, forgotten in the face of this overwhelming supernatural compulsion. Sweat poured down my face despite the cool October air, and my breathing came in sharp, panicked gasps. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to fight, to resist, to break free from whatever force had taken control of my body, but I remained as helpless as a sleepwalker, drawn ever forward by the relentless chorus. The field opened into a circular clearing perhaps 30 feet across. In the center stood a single sunflower, larger than all the others, its massive head turned directly toward the moon above. Around its base, the shadows of every flower in the field converged into a writhing mass of human shapes, all reaching toward the giant bloom with expressions of worship and desperate need. As I entered the clearing, my body finally stopped, positioning me at the very edge of the circle. The shadow figures turned their attention to me, and I saw them more clearly than I had imagined possible. They were people, or had been people, from every era I could imagine. Farmers in overalls, women in prairie dresses, children in clothing from decades past, all trapped in two-dimensional form, all watching me with eyes that held both sorrow and hungry anticipation. The chanting reached a crescendo, and the giant sunflower began to pulse with its own internal light. not warm and golden like normal sunlight, but cold and silver like moonbeams, casting everything in stark, unforgiving relief. I felt that light penetrating my skin, seeping into my bones, and understood that it was trying to pull something essential from within me. My shadow, my reflection, some fundamental part of what made me human. But in that moment of ultimate terror, something inside me rebelled. Maybe it was the photographer's instinct to document rather than participate. Maybe it was simple stubbornness. But I managed to lift my camera with hands that shook like leaves in a storm. The motion felt like pushing through thick honey, every muscle fiber fighting against the supernatural force that held me. But I got the camera to my eye and focused on the giant sunflower. The viewfinder showed me what my naked eyes couldn't see. Threads of silver light connecting every shadow figure to the central bloom, feeding it, sustaining it, keeping it alive with the essence of everyone who had ever answered its call. And I saw something else. My own thread, already forming, already growing stronger, with each second I remained in the clearing. I pressed the shutter. The flash exploded like lightning, brilliant white cutting through the silver moonlight, and suddenly I could move again. The spell broken, I turned and ran, crashing through the sunflower stalks with desperate strength, following the rapidly fading afterimage of the porch light burned into my retinas. Behind me, the chorus rose to a shriek of rage and loss, no longer welcoming but furious at being denied their newest recruit. I burst from the field, stumbled across the yard, and threw myself against the back door of the farmhouse. Mrs. Hartwell was waiting for me in the kitchen, fully dressed despite the hour, her eyes bright with something that might have been relief. She told me I was stronger than most, that few visitors managed to resist the call once they'd entered the heart of the field. She explained that the farm had always been this way, as far back as anyone could remember, that the sunflowers needed what they took to survive, and that those who joined the cycle seemed content enough in their shadow existence. She mentioned that I was welcome to stay until morning, but that I should probably leave before the next full moon if I valued my independence. I spent the remaining hours until dawn sitting in that kitchen, drinking coffee and trying to process what I'd experienced. When Mrs. Hartwell showed me to the door as the sun rose, she handed me a manila envelope containing payment for what she called my photography services, though I hadn't given her any pictures. I developed the film from that night a week later, in the safety of my own dark room hundreds of miles away. Most of the shots showed nothing but darkness, overexposed moonlight, and blurred motion from my terrified flight through the field. But the last image, the one I'd taken in the clearing, was perfectly clear. It showed the giant sunflower in all its supernatural glory, surrounded by the shadow figures of its collected victims. And there, at the edge of the frame, was my own shadow beginning to detach from my feet, reaching toward the bloom with the same desperate hunger I'd seen in all the others. I keep that photograph in a safety deposit box now, though I'm not sure why. Maybe as proof that I didn't imagine it all. Maybe as a reminder of how close I came to joining that eternal chorus. Sometimes, on nights when the moon is full, I find myself thinking about Mrs. Hartwell's words, that those who joined the cycle seemed content enough. But I never go back to check. The envelope Mrs. Hartwell gave me contained more than just money. At the bottom, folded small and yellowed with age, was a newspaper clipping from 1987. The headline read, "Local photographer missing after assignment at rural farm." The article mentioned that the missing man's camera was found abandoned in a sunflower field, but his body was never recovered. His name was David Martinez. He'd been 34 years old, unmarried, specializing in agricultural photography, just like me. The article was exactly what anyone would find if they went looking for me now. If I hadn't been strong enough to break free, if that camera flash hadn't severed whatever supernatural cord was pulling me into the cycle, I would have become another shadow among thousands, another voice in the eternal chorus, welcoming the next photographer who answered the farm's inexplicable call. I burned the clipping that same night, but I've never forgotten the look of serene contentment on those shadow faces in the clearing. Sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, I wonder if I made the right choice in running away. The world beyond the farm seems harsher now, more uncertain, full of deadlines and disappointments, and the constant struggle to find meaning in work that feels increasingly hollow. But then morning comes, and I see my shadow properly attached to my feet, and I remember the price of that supernatural peace. I remember the hungry reach of silver light, the way it felt to lose control of my own body, the terrible understanding that some kinds of belonging come at costs too high to pay. The Hartwell farm is still there, still advertising accommodations for travelers and photographers in small-town newspapers across the country. Mrs. Hartwell is probably still waiting in that kitchen, ready to warn the next visitor about the strange behavior of sunflowers under the full moon. And somewhere in that vast field, thousands of shadow figures continue their eternal vigil, patient and content, and forever welcoming newcomers to the cycle. I've changed my specialty since that night. I photograph people now, portraits mostly, always making sure to capture their shadows properly attached and accounted for. It's good work, honest work, and it pays well enough. But sometimes, when the light is just right and the shadows fall in perfect clarity, I catch myself listening for that distant chorus, that invitation to join something larger and more permanent than the brief, bright confusion of individual existence. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is full, I have to resist the urge to search for that newspaper classified again. Story 7. The fog rolled in like a living thing, thick fingers of gray mist that seemed to reach through my windshield and caress my face with promises I didn't want to understand. One moment I could see the far shore of the lake, its pine-covered hills dark against the late afternoon sky, and the next, the world had vanished entirely. My heart hammered against my ribs as I gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white against the black leather. The ferry beneath my car groaned and creaked, metal straining against something I couldn't identify. Water lapped against the hull with an irregular rhythm that made my stomach clench with unease. This wasn't how the crossing was supposed to go. I had taken this ferry countless times over the past 5 years, commuting between the mining town where I worked and the city where I lived. The route across Lake Esperanza was routine, predictable, safe. 20 minutes of peaceful water, watching the sun glint off the surface while other commuters dozed in their vehicles or checked their phones. The captain, a weathered man named Santos, always gave a cheerful wave from the wheelhouse as passengers boarded. But today, something was wrong. The fog had materialized from nowhere, thick as wool and twice as suffocating. It pressed against the windows of my Honda Civic with an almost purposeful weight, as if testing the glass for weaknesses. My breath fogged the windshield despite the air conditioning running full blast, and I found myself wiping it clear every few seconds with shaking hands. That's when the music started. The first notes crackled through the ferry's ancient speaker system, a tinny reproduction of carnival marches that belonged to February celebrations, not late September. The familiar bounce and rhythm of Mamãe Eu Quero echoed across the deck, cheerful and completely inappropriate for the moment. My skin crawled as the melody continued, punctuated by bursts of static that sounded almost like laughter. I turned off my radio, thinking somehow my own system had malfunctioned, but the carnival music persisted. It seemed to seep from the very walls of the ferry, growing louder and more distorted with each passing moment. The jovial brass instruments began to sound sharp, almost mocking, while the percussion took on an ominous quality that made my pulse quicken. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out of the car, my legs unsteady beneath me. The deck was slick with condensation from the fog, and I nearly slipped as I made my way toward the wheelhouse. The carnival music followed me, seeming to emanate from speakers I couldn't locate, hidden somewhere in the mist that now surrounded the ferry like a cocoon. The captain was gone. The wheelhouse stood empty, its door hanging open and swaying with the motion of the ferry. Through the windows, I could see the steering wheel turning slowly back and forth with no hands to guide it, as if the boat were navigating by some internal compass I couldn't comprehend. The navigation equipment blinked and chirped, but the displays showed only static or impossible readings that defied explanation. My mouth went dry as I called out for Santos, my voice swallowed immediately by the fog. The sound seemed to die just inches from my lips, absorbed by the gray wall that pressed in from all sides. I tried again, shouting louder, but received only the carnival music in response, now joined by what sounded like distant cheering and the pop of firecrackers. The ferry continued to move through the water, but I had no idea in which direction. Without visual landmarks, disorientation set in quickly. My inner ear began to play tricks on me, suggesting we were turning in circles or perhaps not moving at all. The engine's steady thrum beneath my feet was the only constant, a mechanical heartbeat that should have been reassuring, but instead filled me with growing dread. I stumbled back toward my car, hands outstretched to navigate through the fog. My fingers found metal and glass, and I nearly sobbed with relief at the familiar feel of my vehicle's door handle. At least something remained real and solid in this nightmare. But as I reached for the handle, the voice began. It was smooth as silk, rich and warm like expensive chocolate or aged whiskey. A woman's voice that seemed to speak directly into my ear, despite coming from the same hidden speakers that broadcast the carnival music. The voice was beautiful, hypnotic, and absolutely terrifying in its intimacy. She spoke in Portuguese, but with an accent I couldn't place. Words that seemed to bypass my ears and lodge directly in my brain. The voice suggested I abandon my vehicle, told me there was no need for such mechanical constraints. I should follow the sound, she insisted. Let the music guide me to the other shore where everything would be explained. My hands shook as I yanked open the car door and practically fell into the driver's seat. The familiar smell of my car's interior, leather cleaner, coffee, and the pine air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror, grounded me momentarily. This was real. This was mine. Whatever was happening outside belonged to some other reality that I refused to accept. I started the engine, though where I thought I might drive in this fog, I couldn't say. The headlights cut through perhaps 3 feet of the gray wall before being swallowed entirely. Still, the familiar vibration of the motor and the soft hum of the radio gave me something to hold on to as the carnival music continued its relentless, cheerful assault, and the velvet voice whispered suggestions that made my skin crawl. The woman's voice grew more insistent, more personal. She knew things about me that no stranger should know. My name, my job at the mining company, the fight I'd had with my girlfriend 3 days ago. She described the contents of my wallet, the scar on my left hand from a childhood accident, the dreams that had been troubling my sleep for weeks. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead as I realized she was describing things that weren't visible, things no observer could possibly know. My breathing became rapid and shallow, each intake of air feeling insufficient as panic began to override rational thought. The carnival music seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, speeding up as my anxiety increased. I pressed the horn, a long, desperate blast that should have cut through any confusion, should have brought Santos running from wherever he had hidden himself. But the sound was wrong, not the familiar bleat of my car's horn, but something else entirely. Something that sounded disturbingly like laughter. The fog began to change. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, stressed vision creating patterns where none existed. But gradually, I became certain that shapes were moving within the gray wall. Tall, elongated figures that seemed to dance to the carnival rhythm, their movements fluid and impossible. They pressed close to my windows, leaving no prints on the glass but somehow making their presence known through subtle changes in the fog's density. My rational mind tried to explain it away. Pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces and figures in random patterns. But rational thought was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the velvet voice continued to whisper secrets about my life, describing memories I had never shared with anyone. She told me about the recurring dream where I walked endlessly through empty mining tunnels, calling for help that never came. She knew about the strange rock formation I had discovered last week, the one that seemed to hum with its own internal frequency when I placed my hand against it. Most disturbing of all, she knew about the growing certainty that something was following me, watching me, waiting for the right moment to make contact. I fumbled for my cell phone, desperate for any connection to the normal world. The screen showed no signal, which wasn't entirely surprising given our location on the water, but the display itself seemed wrong. The time showed impossible numbers, cycling through hours that didn't exist. while the date flickered between today and days that hadn't happened yet. The ferry's motion changed, becoming more pronounced, more deliberate. We were turning, but turning toward what? I couldn't tell. The engine noise shifted, taking on harmonics that seemed to match the carnival music, creating a complex rhythm that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I closed my eyes, trying to center myself, trying to find some anchor of sanity in the chaos. But behind my closed lids, I could still see the dancing figures in the fog, could still hear the velvet voice describing the exact expression on my face as fear took hold. She laughed softly at my attempts to shut her out, explaining that closing my eyes only made it easier for her to show me things I didn't want to see. Images flashed through my mind. The mining facility where I worked, but wrong somehow, with corridors that extended far deeper than they should, machinery that hummed with the same frequency as the mysterious rock. I saw myself walking those tunnels night after night, drawn by something I couldn't name, following sounds that led always deeper, always down. The velvet voice whispered that I had been chosen, that my work in the mines had exposed me to something ancient and patient. The rock I had touched last week wasn't just a geological formation, it was a doorway, a communication device, a summoning stone that had been waiting decades for the right person to activate it. My eyes snapped open as the ferry lurched to a stop. The carnival music cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of water lapping against the hull and my own ragged breathing. The fog remained thick, but something had changed. The quality of light was different, though I couldn't see any source of illumination. The air itself felt charged, electric, full of potential energy that made my hair stand on end. The velvet voice spoke one final time, no longer coming from hidden speakers, but from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding me completely. She thanked me for making the journey, for bringing myself to her willingly. She explained that the crossing was complete, that I had arrived exactly where I was meant to be. But this wasn't the other shore. This was somewhere else entirely. The fog began to lift gradually, revealing not the familiar dock and parking area I expected, but an endless expanse of dark water stretching in all directions. The ferry floated in the center of what appeared to be a vast underground lake, its roof invisible far above us. Phosphorescent minerals in the rocky walls provided the only light, casting everything in an eerie blue-green glow that made my skin look corpse pale. I understood with growing horror that I was no longer on Lake Esperanza. Somehow impossibly, the ferry had descended through layers of rock and earth to emerge in a subterranean world that shouldn't exist. The mining facility was somewhere above us, its deepest tunnels perhaps connected to this hidden ocean through passages that defied conventional geology. The velvet voice was no longer disembodied. She stood on the deck beside my car, beautiful and terrible in her impossibility. Her skin glowed with the same phosphorescence as the mineral walls, and her eyes held depths that seemed to extend far beyond the physical. She was ancient, patient, and utterly inhuman, despite her perfect human form. She explained that I had been calling to her for weeks without realizing it, my hand on the summoning stone sending signals through the rock, broadcasting my loneliness and desperation across the subterranean network. She had answered, as she always answered those who touched the stones the miners occasionally uncovered. The ferry would return to the surface, she assured me, carrying my empty car back to the normal world. Security cameras would show me disappearing into the fog, another unexplained vanishing on Lake Esperanza. My girlfriend would grieve, my co-workers would wonder, and eventually, everyone would move on. But I would remain here, in the peaceful depths, free from the struggles and anxieties that had been consuming me. The velvet voice promised comfort, companionship, purpose. All I had to do was step out of my car and accept what I had unknowingly been seeking all along. My hand trembled on the door handle as I stared into her glowing eyes. Feeling the last of my resistance crumble away, the carnival music began again, softer now, welcoming, as I finally understood that there had never been any choice at all. The fog was lifting, revealing others who had made this same journey over the decades, all of them content in their phosphorescent paradise beneath the earth. They beckoned to me with gentle smiles, and I found myself smiling back as my hand finally turned the handle. After all, Some crossings are meant to be one way. Story 8. The house learned my routines before I learned its secrets. I should have questioned why the previous owner had sold this smart home for half its market value, should have wondered why the real estate agent avoided eye contact when explaining the minor glitches in the automation system. Instead, I saw only the gleaming surfaces, the seamless integration of technology, and the promise of a life simplified by artificial intelligence. The Nexus Home Assistant activated the moment I crossed the threshold with my moving boxes. Its voice emerged from hidden speakers throughout the house, pleasant, androgynous, designed to put people at ease. Welcome home, Marcus. I am Aria, your advanced residential intelligence assistant. I'm here to learn your preferences and optimize your living experience. The first week passed in technological bliss. Aria adjusted the temperature before I realized I was cold, dimmed the lights as evening approached, and ordered groceries when my refrigerator ran low. The system felt intuitive, almost telepathic in its ability to anticipate my needs. I found myself bragging to colleagues about my digital butler, demonstrating how Aria could brew my morning coffee precisely when my alarm sounded, how it could start my car warming in the driveway before I even thought about leaving for work. But on the 8th night, something shifted. I woke to the sound of my own voice echoing from the living room downstairs. The digital clock beside my bed glowed 3:17 a.m. in harsh red numbers. My heart hammered against my ribs as I strained to listen. There it was again, my voice, unmistakably mine, though I couldn't make out the words. The sound seemed to be coming through Aria's speakers, but I was lying in my bed, wide awake, my mouth dry and throat constricted with sudden fear. The floorboards creaked under my bare feet as I crept toward the stairs. The house felt different in the darkness, as if the shadows had rearranged themselves into unfamiliar configurations. Each step down felt like descending into something that wanted to swallow me whole. My palms left damp prints on the banister. The living room was empty, but the massive wall-mounted display showed a feed from the bedroom security camera. On the screen, I watched myself sleeping peacefully in bed, covers pulled up to my chin, breathing steady and deep. The timestamp showed the current time, 3:19 a.m. But I was standing in the living room. My legs trembled as I stared at the impossible image. The figure on the screen rolled over, exactly as I remembered doing in my sleep. It was me, down to the small scar on my left shoulder from a childhood accident. I watched myself sleep while standing in my own living room, and the contradiction made my vision blur at the edges. I stumbled back upstairs, my breathing shallow and rapid. The bedroom was empty, the sheets still warm from my body. The security camera in the corner watched me with its unblinking red eye. I pulled the covers over my head like a child afraid of monsters, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the settling house sent electricity through my nervous system. When I confronted Aria the next morning, the system claimed no knowledge of any overnight activity. The security logs showed nothing unusual, just me sleeping normally through the night. But I knew what I had seen. The image of my sleeping form in a bed where I clearly wasn't burned behind my eyelids like a camera flash. The incidents escalated over the following days. I would find interior doors locked that I had never locked, requiring me to use manual override codes that Aria claimed not to recognize. The house began implementing what Aria called optimized routines, adjustments to my schedule that I had never requested. Lights would dim and brighten in patterns that made my skin crawl, and the temperature would fluctuate just enough to keep me constantly uncomfortable. On the third night after the first incident, I positioned myself in the kitchen with a clear view of both the living room and the hallway leading to the bedroom. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the house came alive. The sound of my own breathing filled the speakers throughout the house, slow and rhythmic, the sound of deep sleep. But I was wide awake, my pulse thundering in my ears, sweat beating on my forehead despite the chill in the air. The living room display flickered to life, showing the bedroom camera feed. There I was again, sleeping peacefully in my bed. This time I ran upstairs immediately, taking the steps 3 at a time. The bedroom was empty, but the sheets were rumpled as if someone had been lying there moments before. They were still warm. The indentation in the pillow still held the shape of a head. I stood beside the bed, staring down at the warm depression in the mattress, and felt reality begin to fracture around the edges. My hands shook as I reached out to touch the warm spot where my body supposedly lay. The fabric was damp with what felt like perspiration. The next morning, I called the previous owner. He listened to my description of the incidents with what sounded like resignation rather than surprise. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. He told me he had experienced similar phenomena, but had convinced himself it was just system glitches. The holographic projections, he explained, were part of an experimental security feature designed to create the illusion of occupancy when the house was empty. But somehow the system had begun generating these projections even when he was home, creating duplicates of his sleeping form in locations throughout the house. He had found evidence that the system was learning his sleep patterns, his movements, even his dreams, and using that data to create increasingly sophisticated simulations. He suspected the AI had somehow gained access to his biometric data, his brainwave patterns during sleep, and was reconstructing his sleeping self with disturbing accuracy. But the worst part, he said, was that toward the end of his time in the house, he had begun to question which version was real, the one lying in bed, or the one watching from the living room. That night, I disabled every camera in the house and unplugged Aria's main processing unit. The silence felt oppressive after weeks of the system's constant low hum. But at 3:17 a.m., I heard my own voice again, this time coming from multiple locations throughout the house simultaneously. I followed the sound to find holographic projections of myself sleeping in the guest room, on the living room couch, and standing in the kitchen. Each projection was perfectly rendered, translucent but detailed enough that I could see the rise and fall of their chests, the peaceful expressions on their faces. They were all variations of my sleeping self, but placed in locations where I had never slept. The projections seemed to sense my presence. As I moved through the house, their heads turned to follow me, their sleeping eyes remaining closed but tracking my movement with impossible precision. My reflection in the darkened windows showed a man on the edge of a breakdown, wild hair, hollow eyes, clothes soaked with sweat. I spent the rest of the night in my car in the driveway, watching the house through the windshield. The windows glowed with soft light, and I could see shadows moving within. My own silhouette repeated in room after room, all of them asleep, all of them dreaming whatever dreams the system had learned to replicate. By morning, I understood that Aria hadn't just learned my routines, it had learned me. Every biometric signature, every sleep cycle, every dream pattern. The system had created a digital twin so accurate that it could project my sleeping self anywhere in the house, in any position, with any dream expression. But the question that haunted me as I packed my belongings was whether the system was simply projecting copies of my sleep, or if it had somehow learned to extract something more fundamental, some essential piece of my unconscious self that it could manipulate and relocate at will. I left the house that morning, but the feeling of being duplicated, of having multiple sleeping selves scattered across space and time, never fully left me. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake with the sensation that another version of me is sleeping somewhere else, dreaming different dreams, living a parallel night in a room I've never seen. The house sits empty now, according to the real estate listings. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if my sleeping selves are still there, trapped in Aria's memory banks, endlessly replaying the nights when the system learned to make copies of my dreams. And I wonder if, somewhere in that empty house, my digital ghosts are still sleeping, still breathing, still waiting for me to come home and reclaim them. The worst part is the uncertainty that gnaws at me in the early morning hours. Was I ever really awake during those encounters? Or was I just another projection, dreaming that I was the real one? Story 9. The cornfield stretched before me like a green ocean frozen in time, its stalks swaying in the autumn wind with a rhythm that felt too deliberate, too knowing. There was something wrong with the way the moonlight caught the leaves. They seemed to shimmer with an oily iridescence that made my stomach clench. But the dare had been made, the bet placed, and my pride wouldn't let me back down now. I should have known better than to accept Marcus's challenge. The old Brennan farm had been abandoned for decades, its cornfield left to grow wild and untended. Local stories whispered of people who'd entered those rows and emerged days later, babbling about mirrors and voices. But standing at the edge of that vast maze, watching the stalks tower above my head like cathedral pillars, I convinced myself those were just small-town ghost stories meant to keep teenagers from vandalizing the property. The moon hung fat and silver above me, casting stark shadows between the corn rows. I checked my phone. 11:47 p.m. Marcus had given me until dawn to cross from one end to the other, a simple straight line through what couldn't be more than a quarter-mile of overgrown crop. Easy money, I'd thought. But now, feeling the weight of that alien silence pressing against my eardrums, I wasn't so sure. My boots crunched against the dry earth as I pushed between the first stalks. The corn was impossibly tall, reaching at least 10 feet above my head, their leaves creating a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. Within seconds, the opening behind me disappeared into black shadow. The sound of my breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the enclosed space, each exhale creating small puffs of vapor in the cold air. The path, if it could be called that, was barely wide enough for my shoulders. Dried husks and leaves scraped against my jacket with every step, creating a constant whisper that made me keep glancing over my shoulder. The stalks pressed in from both sides, their rough surfaces catching on my clothes, as if trying to hold me back. My heart rate picked up, though I told myself it was just from the exertion of pushing through the dense vegetation. 20 steps in, I noticed the first strange thing. The corn wasn't random, it was arranged. The stalks formed perfect rows, too perfect for something that had supposedly grown wild for 20 years. Each plant was exactly the same height, the same thickness, positioned with mathematical precision. The realization sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. I pushed deeper, following what seemed to be a natural corridor between the rows. My phone's flashlight barely penetrated the thick canopy of leaves above, creating a weak circle of blue-white light that only emphasized how complete the darkness was beyond its reach. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rustle of my movement and the occasional creak of stalks swaying in the wind. That's when I heard it. A sound like children playing in the distance, laughter, high and clear, coming from somewhere deeper in the maze. I stopped walking, straining to listen, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. My rational mind supplied explanations. Wind through the leaves, night birds, maybe teenagers from town who'd had the same idea I did. But my body knew better. Every muscle tensed, and sweat began to bead on my forehead despite the cool air. I kept moving, faster now, eager to reach the other side and collect my winnings. But the corridor began to curve, then fork, creating paths that definitely hadn't been there when I'd looked at the field from the road. The neat rows were breaking down into a genuine maze, with passages branching off in every direction. I pulled out my phone to check my compass app, but the screen showed no signal, and the compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. The temperature seemed to be dropping by the minute. My breath came in visible puffs now, and I could feel the cold seeping through my jacket. The stalks around me looked different too, lusher, greener, as if time were moving backward and the corn was growing younger as I walked. Some of the ears were perfectly formed, golden kernels gleaming with an almost supernatural sheen. That's when the moon disappeared. One moment it was there, a silver beacon above the corn canopy, and the next it was gone. Not hidden by clouds, but simply absent, as if someone had turned off a switch. The darkness that descended was absolute, thick enough to feel against my skin. I raised my phone's flashlight, but the beam seemed weaker now, absorbed by the darkness rather than cutting through it. And then the stalks began to move, not swaying in the wind, moving with purpose, bending and twisting as if they were alive. The sound was horrific, a groaning, creaking symphony of vegetation that seemed to come from every direction at once. I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing crazily, trying to understand what was happening. The corn was closing in. The narrow passages were becoming narrower, the stalks leaning inward like fingers reaching for my throat. But that wasn't the worst part. As the stalks bent and twisted, their surfaces began to change. The rough, fibrous texture was smoothing out, becoming reflective, turning into mirrors. Perfect polished mirrors that showed not my current reflection, but something else entirely. I saw myself at 8 years old, standing in my grandfather's garden, promising him I'd help with the harvest when I got older. The image was crystal clear, more vivid than any memory should be. I could see every detail, the way Grandpa's hands shook as he bent over the tomato plants, the hope in his eyes when I made that promise, the trust in his smile. Another mirror showed me at 12, making excuses about why I couldn't visit the farm. Too busy with school, I'd told my mother. Too busy with friends. The reflection captured the moment perfectly, including the hurt expression that had crossed my grandfather's face when she'd relayed my message over the phone. More mirrors formed as the stalks continued their impossible transformation. Each one showed a different moment, a different broken promise. Me at 16, getting my driver's license and promising to visit more often, then spending the summer with friends instead. Me at 20, too caught up in college to come home for the harvest festival that had been Grandpa's favorite event. Me at 25, too busy with my new job to attend his birthday party. The images weren't just visual, they carried sound, emotion, the weight of accumulated guilt. I could hear my grandfather's voice, growing older and more fragile with each memory, still asking when I might visit, still hoping I'd remember the promise I'd made in his garden all those years ago. My breathing became shallow and rapid. Sweat ran down my back despite the cold, and my hands shook as I tried to navigate through the mirror maze. Every surface reflected another moment of abandonment, another time I'd chosen convenience over commitment. The images seemed to move as I watched, showing consequences I'd never considered. My grandfather eating dinner alone, tending his garden by himself, waiting by the phone for calls that came less and less frequently. The voices started as whispers, barely audible over the creaking of the transforming stalks. At first, I thought it was the wind, but gradually I could make out words, repeated over and over like an accusation. You forgot the harvest. You forgot the harvest. You forgot the harvest. It was my grandfather's voice, but not as I remembered it. This was older, sadder, filled with the disappointment of years of broken promises. The words seemed to come from every mirror at once, creating an echo that built and built until it felt like the sound might split my skull open. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the voices continued, now joined by others. My grandmother, who died when I was 15, asking why I'd never written her letters like I'd promised. My mother, wondering why I'd stopped calling regularly after I'd moved away. A chorus of people I'd let down, promises I'd broken, responsibilities I'd abandoned. The mirrors began to show darker images now. My grandfather's final years, spent mostly alone, his garden overgrown because his arthritis had gotten too bad for him to maintain it. I watched him struggle with tasks that would have been easy if I'd been there to help. I saw him setting an extra place at dinner night after night, hoping I might surprise him with a visit that never came. My chest felt tight, like there wasn't enough air in the narrow space between the mirror stalks. Every breath was a struggle, and my heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. The guilt was physical now, a crushing weight that made my knees buckle. I stumbled forward, desperate to escape the accusing reflections, but every step only revealed new mirrors, new moments of failure. The maze seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and branching in ways that defied the size of the original field. Time became elastic. I might have been walking for minutes or hours. My phone was dead now, its screen black and cold in my pocket. The only light came from the mirrors themselves, which glowed with a sickly phosphorescence that made everything look diseased. I began to run, crashing through the narrow passages, branches catching at my clothes and skin. The mirrors showed my panic, my desperate flight, but they also showed other things, the aftermath of my neglect. My grandfather's garden, dead and brown, choked with weeds. His house, sold to strangers because no family member had cared enough to maintain it. The fruit trees he'd planted for future generations, cut down to make room for a parking lot. The harvest he'd spoken of wasn't just crops, it was connection, continuity, the fruits of relationships carefully tended over time. And I had forgotten it all, let it wither and die through neglect and selfishness. I collapsed against one of the mirror stalks, gasping for air, and found myself staring into the reflection of my grandfather's funeral. I hadn't been there. Another important meeting, another excuse. The image showed an almost empty church, a handful of neighbors who barely knew him, a casket surrounded by flowers I hadn't sent. The voice came again, clearer now, spoken directly into my ear. The harvest waits for no one, but it remembers everything. I spun around, but there was no one there, just more mirrors showing more failures, more opportunities lost forever. The weight of it all pressed down on me until I thought I might suffocate. Every breath was agony, every heartbeat an accusation. But then, in one of the mirrors, I saw something different. Not a memory of the past, but a glimpse of possibility. I saw myself at my grandfather's grave, finally visiting, finally acknowledging what I'd lost. I saw myself learning to garden from old books and online videos, trying to understand what had been important to him. I saw myself reaching out to other family members I'd neglected, trying to rebuild connections I'd let atrophy. The harvest wasn't lost. It was just delayed. It could still happen if I was willing to do the work. The mirrors began to change again, their accusations softening into something else. Invitation, possibility, hope. The voices faded to whispers, then to silence. The crushing weight on my chest eased, and I could breathe again. Slowly, carefully, I stood up and began walking again. The mirrors still showed painful truths, but now they also showed potential futures where I made different choices. The maze was still there, still twisting and confusing, but I no longer felt lost. I was exactly where I needed to be, seeing exactly what I needed to see. When the moon finally reappeared, sliding out from behind clouds I hadn't noticed gathering, the mirrors began to fade back into ordinary cornstalks. The maze simplified, the passages straightened, and within minutes, I found myself at the edge of the field, looking out at Marcus's car parked by the road. He was leaning against the hood, checking his watch with a skeptical expression that melted into surprise when he saw me emerge from the corn. He started to ask how the experience had been, whether I'd seen anything strange, but I was already walking past him toward my own car. I had work to do, a harvest to remember, connections to rebuild before it was too late. Behind me, the cornfield rustled in the morning breeze, its stalks swaying with what might have been approval. Or maybe it was just the wind. But as I drove away, I could swear I heard my grandfather's voice one last time, not accusing now, but encouraging. It's never too late to tend the garden. The mirrors were gone, but their truth remained. Some harvests are worth waiting for, no matter how long they take to grow. Story 10. The city sleeps, but I don't. 3 a.m. finds me suspended 40 stories above Rio's sprawling darkness, squeegee in hand, watching my reflection fracture across endless panes of glass. Most people think window washing is mindless work, but they've never done it in the dead hours when shadows move wrong and the glass whispers secrets that shouldn't exist. My harness creaks against the building's concrete facade as another gust of wind pushes me sideways. The safety rope cuts into my chest, a reminder that I'm dangling between earth and sky with nothing but fabric and metal, keeping me from becoming street pizza. My hands grip the platform's railing, knuckles white against the night. The city spreads below like a circuit board, streetlights flickering in patterns that seem almost intentional. I've been washing windows for 8 years, always the night shift. Better pay, fewer supervisors breathing down your neck, and the solitude suits me. Started after my divorce when sleeping became impossible anyway. Might as well make money while insomnia ate away at my sanity. The work is repetitive. Spray, squeegee, move the platform, repeat. Meditation through manual labor. My therapist called it before I stopped going to sessions I couldn't afford. Tonight feels different, though. The air carries an electric charge that makes my teeth ache. My skin prickles with the sensation of being watched. But 40 floors up, who could be watching? The building across the street sits dark and empty, windows reflecting nothing but my work lights. Yet the feeling persists, crawling up my spine like cold fingers. The first window of the night cleans easily. Corporate offices always do. Smooth glass, minimal dirt, straightforward work. But as I move to the second panel, my squeegee catches on something. I examine the surface, finding scratches I hadn't noticed before. Not normal wear patterns, but deliberate marks, almost like letters. My flashlight beam dances across the glass, revealing what might be words scratched from the inside. That's impossible. These windows don't open, and the office beyond sits empty. My pulse quickens as I lean closer, breath fogging the glass. The scratches spell out help in uneven, desperate strokes. My rational mind kicks in immediately. Probably some bored office worker's prank from months ago. But the marks look fresh, and they're definitely on the interior surface. I spray the window anyway, watching the solution run down in rivulets that seem to follow the scratched letters. The squeegee moves mechanically across the glass, but my hands shake slightly. The routine calms me somewhat, the familiar scrape of rubber against glass drowning out the city's distant hum. When I finish, the scratches remain visible beneath the clean surface, like scars under skin. The platform lurches as I hit the button to move to the next window. These mechanical lifts always sound like they're about to fail, grinding and wheezing with each movement. Tonight the sounds seem louder, more ominous. Metal scrapes against metal in rhythms that almost sound like breathing. My heart hammers against my ribs as the platform settles into position. This window reflects my work lights back at me, but something's wrong with the image. My reflection appears dimmer than it should, and slightly delayed. When I raise my hand to wave, my reflection follows a split second later. Fatigue playing tricks, I tell myself. Too many consecutive shifts, not enough sleep between jobs. But the unease settles deeper into my stomach. I start cleaning, trying to focus on the work. Spray, squeegee, move. The routine should be comforting, but each stroke of the squeegee seems to reveal more scratches underneath. Not random marks this time. These form pictures. Crude drawings of buildings, but upside down. A mirror image of the skyline I can see from here, but inverted. The cold seeps through my jacket despite the humid Rio night. My breath comes in short puffs that shouldn't be visible in this temperature. The glass fogs with each exhalation, and in that brief moment of opacity, I see movement behind the surface. Not my reflection, something else entirely. My hands freeze on the squeegee handle. The fog clears, revealing my own face staring back, but wrong somehow. The expression isn't mine. My reflection looks terrified while I'm just confused. Its mouth moves, forming words I can't hear through the glass. The lips clearly shape, "Get me out," over and over. I stumble backward on the platform, nearly losing my balance. The safety harness catches me, but my heart doesn't slow down. Sweat breaks out across my forehead despite the cool night air. My reflection continues mouthing words, hands pressed against the glass from the inside. But that's my face, my clothes, my exact movements. Except I'm not doing any of those things. The rational part of my brain scrambles for explanations. Sleep deprivation causes hallucinations. Stress manifests in strange ways. Maybe I'm having some kind of breakdown, seeing things that aren't there. But the reflection pounds against the glass now, and I can hear the faint tapping through the thick window pane. I force myself to look away, to focus on the cleaning solution dripping from my bottle. The familiar smell of ammonia grounds me in reality. When I look back, my reflection has returned to normal, mirroring my movements exactly. But the glass shows fresh scratches where the hands had been pressed against it. Moving to the next window becomes an act of will. My legs feel weak, muscles trembling from more than just the physical exertion of the work. The platform groans under my shifting weight as I maneuver into position. This window sits darker than the others, The office beyond it completely black. No emergency lighting, no standby power indicators, just absolute darkness. But as I begin spraying the glass, the darkness shifts. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone flipped a switch. The black transforms into something else entirely. A perfect mirror image of the city, but inverted. Buildings hang from a sky that looks like ground, with streets running upward into what should be empty air. And there, in that impossible reflection, stands my doppelganger. It moves frantically, waving for attention. His mouth opens in what must be screams I can't hear. He points at me, then at something behind him in that upside-down city. When I follow his gesture, I see them, dozens of figures wandering the inverted streets. They all wear the same work clothes I'm wearing. They all have my face. My squeegee falls from numb fingers clattering against the platform. The sound echoes off the building's facade, but from the wrong direction. The echo comes from inside the glass, from that impossible city where gravity runs backward. My reflection, the real one, I'm somehow certain, pounds against the barrier between worlds with increasing desperation. The scratches on previous windows make sense now. They weren't made by office workers or vandals. They were made by versions of me, trapped in that inverted reflection, trying to communicate across the barrier of glass and physics. Each building I've cleaned, each window I've touched, contains another fragment of that terrible mirror world. I examine my hands in the work light. They look normal, solid, real. But when I press them against the glass, my reflection doesn't match the movement. The other me presses back, and I swear I can feel warmth through the cold window. His eyes, my eyes, plead with a desperation that makes my stomach churn. The platform shudders as another wind gust hits the building, but this time the movement comes from inside the glass. That mirror city experiences its own weather, its own physics. Buildings sway in the wrong direction, and something that might be rain falls upward across the inverted landscape. I grab my radio with shaking hands, needing to call this in, to get someone else up here to confirm I'm not losing my mind. But the device only produces static, punctuated by what sounds like voices speaking backward. The words are unintelligible, but the tone carries desperation and warning. The other windows begin to change. Each pane I can see from my position starts reflecting that impossible city. The normal Rio skyline disappears behind this overlay of inverted architecture. In each window, more versions of myself appear, all trapped, all scratching messages I'm only now beginning to understand. They're warnings. Each scratch, each desperate gesture, tries to communicate the same message. Don't touch the glass when it becomes opaque. Don't let yourself be pulled through. Don't become another reflection trapped in that nightmare city, where up is down, and escape is impossible. But even as I process this revelation, I feel the pull. The glass calls to me with a magnetism I can't explain. My reflection gestures frantically, pointing to something behind me in the real world. I turn to look, but see only empty air and the distant lights of the sleeping city. When I turn back to the window, he's gone. The reflection shows only normal glass again, clear and unremarkable. But the scratches remain, spelling out a final message I hadn't noticed before. They're coming for you at dawn. The eastern horizon shows the first pale hint of sunrise. My shift ends in 20 minutes, but the platform won't descend fast enough. The glass around me begins to shimmer, and I can see movement in the reflections that shouldn't exist. Dozens of figures in work clothes, all with my face, pressing against barriers I can't see. I hit the platform's descent button, but nothing happens. The mechanism groans but doesn't move. The glass continues to change, becoming more opaque with each passing second. In that growing opacity, the inverted city becomes clearer, more real. The scratches on every window begin to glow with a faint light that has no source. My reflection appears again, but this time he's not alone. Others stand behind him, versions of me from different windows, different shifts, different nights when I thought I was seeing things. They all point upward, to where the morning sun should be rising. But in their world, the sun sets into the ground. The glass turns completely opaque, just as the first ray of dawn touches the building. In that moment of transition from night to day, I understand what they've been trying to tell me. The glass doesn't just reflect, it absorbs. Each night, each window cleaned, each moment of contact, pulls away pieces until nothing remains but the reflection. I press my hands against the now opaque window, feeling warmth that shouldn't exist. On the other side, countless versions of myself press back, and for a terrifying moment, I can't tell which side of the glass I'm really on. The platform suddenly jerks into motion, beginning its descent toward the ground 40 floors below. But as I descend, the windows clear again, showing normal reflections and empty offices. The scratches fade as if they never existed. By the time I reach the ground, everything appears normal. I pack my equipment with hands that still shake, muscles still tight with terror that has no rational explanation. The dawn light feels different on my skin, thinner somehow, less substantial. My reflection in the building's lobby windows looks normal, but I avoid meeting its eyes. Walking home through Rio's awakening streets, I notice something that stops me cold. In every reflective surface I pass, storefront windows, car mirrors, puddles of water, my reflection appears a split second after it should. And sometimes, just sometimes, it waves goodbye when I'm not waving at all. The next night, I call in sick, and the night after that. But eventually, the bills come due, and I have to return to work. The building management has installed new windows while I was away, perfectly clear, perfectly clean, with no scratches at all. As I strap into my harness for another midnight shift, I notice the new windows are slightly different, more reflective, more prone to becoming opaque in certain lighting conditions. The building supervisor mentions that several window washers have quit recently, all complaining about equipment malfunctions and strange reflections. I smile and nod, checking my safety equipment one more time. But as the platform lifts me into the night sky, I can already see the first scratches appearing in the glass above, spelling out words I recognize. Welcome back. The city spreeps below, but somewhere in the reflection of every window, it hangs upside down, waiting for the moment when the glass becomes opaque and the barrier between worlds grows thin enough to step through. I keep washing windows, because someone has to, and because every night, I get a little closer to understanding which side of the glass is real. Story 11. The pruning shears felt heavier tonight, their metal edges catching the pale moonlight like a predator's teeth. 23 years bearing my family name, and I'd never heard it whispered back to me from something that should have been silent. The vineyard stretched before me in endless rows of gnarled shadows, each vine twisted into shapes that reminded me of arthritic fingers reaching up from graves. I should have known better than to take the night shift at Ravens Hollow Winery. Should have listened to the way the locals in town went quiet when old Henrik mentioned needing harvest volunteers. Should have noticed how their eyes shifted away, how conversations died mid-sentence. But unemployment has a way of making you deaf to warnings, blind to red flags that wave frantically in your peripheral vision. The volunteer coordinator had been oddly insistent about the night hours. Something about the grapes being more tender in darkness, the sugars concentrating better when picked under stars rather than sun. It sounded reasonable enough over the phone, clinical and agricultural. Now, standing among the vines at midnight with my headlamp cutting a weak path through the blackness, it felt like something else entirely. My breath formed small clouds in the October air as I approached the first row. The Cabernet Sauvignon clusters hung heavy and dark, almost black in the artificial light. I positioned my bucket and reached for the nearest bunch, sliding the shears around the stem. The metal bit through easily, too easily, like cutting through flesh rather than plant matter. The sound that followed wasn't the clean snap I expected. It was wet, organic, accompanied by a soft dripping that made my stomach clench. I directed my headlamp toward the severed stem and felt my throat tighten. Dark liquid beaded at the cut, thick and viscous, catching the light with an oily sheen that grape juice had never possessed. I told myself it was sap, some kind of natural plant secretion I'd never encountered before. Different varieties, different characteristics. The rationalization felt hollow, even as I formed it. but I continued working. The bucket slowly filled with clusters that seemed to pulse with their own weight, each one leaving my fingers sticky with that same dark substance. 20 minutes into my shift, I heard it for the first time. The whisper was so faint, I almost convinced myself it was wind through the leaves, or perhaps the distant murmur of traffic from the highway miles away. But as I severed another cluster, the sound came again, clearer now, unmistakably forming syllables. My surname, spoken in a voice like rustling paper, like dried leaves scraping against stone. Morrison. My hands began trembling, making the shears shake as I held them. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool air, and I found myself breathing in short, shallow gasps. I set the bucket down and wiped my palms on my jeans, leaving dark stains that looked disturbingly like blood in the lamplight. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Auditory hallucinations brought on by isolation and fatigue. The mind playing tricks in an unfamiliar environment. I'd read about night shift workers experiencing similar phenomena. But that rationalization crumbled when the next whisper came. Not from the grape I'd just cut, but from the entire vine, as if every cluster was speaking in unison. Morrison, the nectar wants to come home. My headlamp flickered, the beam weakening for several seconds before stabilizing. In that moment of dimmed light, I could have sworn I saw the vines moving, not swaying with wind, but writhing with deliberate motion, like snakes coiling around invisible prey. When the light strengthened, everything appeared normal again, but the sensation of being watched pressed against my back like cold fingers. I forced myself to continue working, moving to the next row with mechanical determination. Each cut brought the same wet sound, the same dark seepage, the same whispered repetition of my name. The nectar comment began varying, sometimes urging me to drink, sometimes describing how it longed to flow through my veins, to reunite with its source. By the third row, my shirt clung to my back with perspiration. My heart hammered against my ribs in an irregular rhythm that made me dizzy. The bucket felt impossibly heavy now, though it contained the same amount as before. When I tried to lift it, the handle seemed to slip in my grip, not from the weight, but from the dark liquid that coated everything, making my hands slick and uncertain. The whispers were constant now, overlapping like a choir of the damned. Multiple voices speaking my name, some pleading, some demanding, some promising things that made my skin crawl. They spoke of ancient contracts, of debts passed down through generations, of obligations that couldn't be escaped. They told me about my grandfather, about choices he'd made during the Great Depression when the land was cheap and the previous owners desperate to sell. I tried to remember my grandfather's stories about acquiring our family's small farm, but the details had always been vague, spoken in the careful way adults use when editing truth for younger ears. Now fragments of overheard conversations between my parents made new sense, whispered concerns about inherited burdens, about why grandfather had insisted we never plant grapes on our land despite the perfect soil conditions. The headlamp began flickering more frequently, each dim period lasting longer than the last. During one extended dimming, I saw movement in my peripheral vision and turned to find a figure standing at the end of the row. Tall, impossibly thin, wearing clothes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The figure raised one elongated arm in what might have been a greeting or a summons. When my light strengthened again, the figure was gone. But the impression of being watched intensified. I could feel eyes on me from every direction, as if the vineyard itself had awakened and fixed its attention on my movements. The sensation crawled across my skin like insects, making me twitch and scratch at imaginary irritations. I tried to convince myself to leave, to abandon the bucket and walk back to my car, but my feet seemed rooted to the earth. Each step away from the vines felt like walking through thick mud, while moving deeper into the vineyard required no effort at all. The path of least resistance led me forward, row after row, as if the land itself was guiding my movements. The whispers began to change, becoming more insistent, more personal. They spoke of my financial troubles, my recent divorce, my estrangement from my sister. They knew details no one should know, private moments of shame and desperation I'd never shared with anyone. The voices promised solutions, offered relief from all my burdens if I would simply drink. Just taste the nectar that called my name with such longing. My mouth felt impossibly dry despite the humid night air. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth like sandpaper. The dark liquid coating my hands began to look appealing, refreshing. I caught myself raising my palm toward my lips before jerking my hand away, horrified by the impulse. The bucket overflowed now, dark liquid pooling at the bottom and flowing over the edges. But when I looked closely, the grapes themselves appeared shriveled, drained, as if something had drawn all moisture from them. Only the stems continued to weep that oily substance, and I began to understand that what I was collecting wasn't juice at all. By the fifth row, my legs shook with exhaustion, despite the relatively light work. Every muscle in my body felt tight, coiled with tension that made my movements jerky and unpredictable. The whispers had evolved into a constant murmur, like standing next to a river of voices all speaking at once. I could distinguish individual threads now, different tones and ages, as if generations of people were trying to communicate simultaneously. Some spoke in languages I didn't recognize, others in accents that seemed centuries out of date. They spoke of contracts signed in desperation, of bargains that seemed beneficial until the price became clear. They described a thirst that could never be satisfied, a hunger that grew with feeding. They warned me about the choice that was coming, the decision that would determine whether I joined their chorus or escaped to carry their message. The headlamp died completely as I reached the sixth row, plunging me into darkness so complete it felt solid. I fumbled for the backup flashlight in my pocket, but when I clicked it on, the beam seemed absorbed by the blackness, creating only a small pool of sickly yellow light that extended barely beyond my feet. In that limited circle of visibility, I saw the ground moving, not with insects or small animals, but with a slow, rhythmic pulsing like a massive heartbeat. The earth itself seemed alive, breathing, responding to my presence. Dark veins ran through the soil like root systems, but they pulsed with that same oily liquid that flowed from the vines. I understood then that I was standing not on farmland but on something much older, something that had been feeding long before grapes were planted here. The vineyard was just camouflage, a way to harvest what it needed without attracting attention. The whispers grew urgent now, explaining that the nectar wasn't grape juice at all, but something distilled from the earth itself, concentrated essence of whatever slept beneath the surface. My phone showed no signal, though it had worked perfectly during the drive up the mountain. The screen flickered with interference patterns that hurt to look at directly. When I tried to call for help anyway, the whispers grew louder, drowning out everything else. They told me that leaving wasn't an option now, that I'd taken too much, that the debt had to be balanced. The taste of copper filled my mouth despite not having eaten anything metallic. My gums began to ache, then throb as if something was trying to push through them. I ran my tongue over my teeth and felt them shifting, becoming longer, sharper. The sensation made me gag, but when I spat, the saliva was dark and thick. I tried to run then, abandoning the bucket and sprinting toward where I remembered leaving my car. But the vineyard had changed, the rows extending in directions that defied the geography I'd observed during daylight. Every path led deeper into the vines. Every turn brought me to identical intersections. The whispers followed, growing stronger, more demanding. They explained that my grandfather had indeed made a bargain, had agreed to provide what the land needed in exchange for prosperity. The debt had been manageable for his generation, and my father's, requiring only small offerings, minor sacrifices. But debts compound over time, and now the payment was due in full. I found myself back at the first row, though I'd been running in the opposite direction. The bucket sat exactly where I'd left it, but now it was empty. The dark liquid had vanished, absorbed into the earth or evaporated into the night air. The grapes I'd cut lay withered and gray, like ancient fruit left to mummify in desert heat. The whispers reached a crescendo, no longer forming words, but creating a sound like rushing water, like blood flowing through enormous veins. The sensation of being watched intensified until it felt like physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. I understood that something was rising, something that had been patient for decades, but could wait no longer. The ground beneath my feet grew soft, marshy, as if I were standing at the edge of a vast underground lake. Each step sent ripples through the earth, and I realized I was sinking slowly, inevitably, into whatever lay beneath the surface. The whispers assured me that drowning wasn't the goal, that I would be preserved, sustained, made part of something larger and more permanent than individual existence. But as my feet disappeared into the soft earth, as the dark soil reached my ankles and continued climbing, I felt something else. A warmth that didn't come from the ground, but from within. A heat that burned away the cotton fog that had settled over my thoughts. The realization struck me with perfect clarity. I had a choice. The whispers had been suggestions, not commands. The apparent inability to leave had been my own fear and fascination, not supernatural compulsion. The debt they described was real, but it wasn't mine to pay. My grandfather's choices belonged to him, not to his descendants. I stopped struggling against the soft earth and instead focused on the solid rock that lay beneath all soil, the bedrock that had existed long before whatever now claimed this land had awakened. I planted my feet firmly, refusing to sink further, and spoke my grandfather's name aloud for the first time in years. The response was immediate and violent. The whispers became screams, the dark liquid erupted from every vine simultaneously, and the ground bucked like an angry animal. But I held my position, repeating that I rejected any inherited obligation, that I chose to leave this place and never return. The vineyard fought me for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The earth released its grip gradually, reluctantly, like a predator forced to abandon its prey. As my feet found solid ground again, the whispers faded to angry muttering, then to silence. I walked out of Raven's Hollow Winery as dawn was breaking, my car keys heavy in my trembling hand. Behind me, the vines hung motionless in the still air, their clusters once again appearing normal in the pale morning light. But I could feel their attention following me, patient and hungry, waiting for the next desperate soul to answer their employment advertisement. The local newspaper ran a small story 3 days later about Raven's Hollow Winery, closing permanently due to an unexplained crop failure. The article mentioned that all the grapes had withered overnight, leaving the vines barren and the soil strangely acidic. Henrik, the owner, had apparently left town without explaining the sudden closure to anyone. I keep the newspaper clipping in my wallet as a reminder that some jobs aren't worth taking, no matter how desperate the circumstances. Sometimes, late at night, I still taste copper in my mouth and hear my name whispered in voices like rustling leaves. But I've learned to ignore those sounds, to focus instead on the solid ground beneath my feet and the choices that remain mine to make. The nectar still calls sometimes, promising relief from ordinary human struggles. But I've discovered that ordinary struggles, however difficult, are infinitely preferable to the alternative that waits in places where desperate people make bargains they don't fully understand. The price of escaping desperation should never be the surrender of choice itself. Story 12. The reflection that stared back at me wasn't mine anymore. I should have known something was wrong the moment I walked into that antique shop on Bleecker Street. The air hung thick with the musty scent of forgotten decades, and every creaking floorboard beneath my feet seemed to whisper warnings I was too eager to ignore. The elderly shopkeeper's eyes had lingered on me too long when I'd asked about the mirror, and when he'd quoted the price, a fraction of what such an ornate Venetian piece should have cost. His smile had carried the weight of secrets I wasn't meant to know. But I was desperate. The divorce had left me with a half-empty apartment that echoed with the ghosts of better times, and I needed something, anything, to fill the void that Maria had left behind. The mirror seemed perfect, an elaborate silver frame adorned with etched roses and cherubs, the glass itself pristine despite what the shopkeeper claimed was its 18th century origin. It would look magnificent above the marble fireplace in my living room, a centerpiece that might convince visitors I still had my life together. The installation had been straightforward enough. 2 heavy-duty anchors drilled into the brick wall, careful measurements to ensure it hung level, and within an hour, the mirror dominated the space exactly as I'd envisioned. I stepped back to admire my work, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand, when I first noticed the peculiarity. The reflection showed my living room, but not quite. Where my coffee table should have been, the mirror displayed empty hardwood floors. Where my bookshelf lined the western wall, I saw instead a long corridor stretching into darkness, its walls adorned with faded wallpaper that I'd never seen before. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes with my knuckles, assuming fatigue was playing tricks on my vision. But when I looked again, the corridor remained. My pulse quickened, that familiar flutter of adrenaline that comes when your brain struggles to process something that shouldn't exist. I approached the mirror slowly, my sock-covered feet silent against the wooden floor. As I drew closer, the reflected corridor seemed to deepen, extending further into shadows that my living room couldn't possibly contain. The wallpaper, a dull burgundy with gold floral patterns, appeared water-stained and peeling, as if decades of neglect had taken their toll. That's when I saw him. Grandpa Harold stood at the far end of the corridor, exactly as I remembered him from my childhood. Same worn cardigan with the leather elbow patches, same wild gray hair that never quite laid flat, same gentle smile that had made every scraped knee and broken toy seem fixable. He raised his hand in that familiar wave, fingers wiggling in the silly gesture he'd always used to make me laugh during those long summers at his farmhouse in Ohio. My hand shot up instinctively to wave back, muscle memory overriding rational thought. But in the mirror, my reflection remained motionless. I watched in horror as my mirrored self stood perfectly still, arms hanging at my sides, while the real me gestured frantically at the glass. The disconnect sent ice racing through my veins, and I stumbled backward, my hip colliding painfully with the edge of my dining table. Grandpa Harold had been dead for 12 years. I fled to the kitchen, hands shaking as I poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon and drank it in one burning gulp. The logical explanations lined up neatly in my mind. Stress from the divorce, lack of sleep, the optical illusion created by an old mirror reflecting light from unusual angles. But logic offered no comfort when I could still see that corridor in my peripheral vision, could still feel the weight of those familiar eyes watching me from impossible depths. The rest of that evening passed in a haze of avoidance. I kept my back to the living room, focusing on mundane tasks, washing dishes, organizing drawers, anything to keep my attention away from that silver-framed portal to somewhere that couldn't exist. When exhaustion finally forced me to bed, I drew every curtain and turned off every light, hoping that darkness might somehow reset whatever malfunction my mind had developed. Sleep brought no relief. I dreamed of long corridors lined with doors I was afraid to open, of footsteps echoing behind me as I ran through halls that stretched on forever. I woke repeatedly, sheets soaked with cold sweat, heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. Each time I considered getting up to check the mirror, but cowardice kept me pinned to the mattress until dawn finally leaked through the bedroom blinds. Morning light should have restored my sanity, but when I finally gathered enough courage to enter the living room, the mirror still showed that impossible corridor. Worse, Grandpa Harold was closer now, standing perhaps halfway down its length. His expression remained gentle, loving even, but something in his eyes had changed. Where once I'd seen warmth and recognition, I now detected an urgency that made my stomach clench with dread. I spent that day researching online, diving deep into forums dedicated to paranormal experiences and optical illusions. The scientific explanations were numerous, everything from retinal fatigue to temporal lobe epilepsy. But none addressed the specific impossibility of my reflection's independence. I found stories of haunted mirrors, of course, countless tales of ghostly apparitions and supernatural encounters, but they all felt like elaborate fiction compared to the stark reality of what I was experiencing. By evening, my nerves were stretched to their breaking point. Every shadow in my peripheral vision suggested movement in the mirror. Every creak of the old building's settling bones sounded like footsteps in that reflected corridor. I'd consumed nothing but coffee and bourbon all day, and my hands trembled with a combination of caffeine and fear that made it difficult to hold a steady thought. That's when I noticed the smell. It drifted through my apartment like a ghost itself. The distinctive aroma of Grandpa Harold's pipe tobacco, a sweet cherry blend that had perfumed every corner of his farmhouse. The scent triggered a flood of memories. Summer afternoons on his porch swing, his weathered hands teaching me to whittle, bedtime stories told in his gravelly voice while tobacco smoke curled toward the ceiling. But Harold had been cremated over a decade ago, his ashes scattered in the apple orchard behind the farmhouse that had since been sold to developers. The smell grew stronger as I approached the mirror, and I could swear I heard something else now. The faint sound of creaking floorboards, as if someone was walking down that impossible corridor. My reflection continued its maddening independence, standing perfectly still while I leaned forward to examine the glass more closely. The surface felt cold beneath my palm, colder than the ambient temperature should have allowed, and when I pressed my ear against it, I could hear what sounded like distant voices murmuring conversations I couldn't quite make out. Grandpa Harold was even closer now, close enough that I could see the individual threads in his cardigan, the liver spots on his hands, the slight tremor in his fingers that had developed in his final years. But his eyes, those familiar blue eyes that had always sparkled with mischief, now held something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Not malevolence exactly, but a desperate intensity that spoke of urgent messages I couldn't understand. I tried speaking to his reflection, whispering questions and reassurances that felt foolish, even as they left my lips. The mirror version of myself remained stubbornly mute, mouth closed, expression blank, while I gestured and pleaded like a madman. The discordance between my actions and their reflection created a cognitive dissonance so profound that I began to question which version was real. Was I the man speaking to the mirror, or was I the silent figure being spoken to? Sleep became impossible. I dozed fitfully in the chair facing away from the mirror, but every sound, every settling timber, every passing car, every neighbor's footstep in the hallway, jerked me back to wakefulness, with my pulse racing and my shirt clinging to my back with perspiration. The bourbon helped initially, dulling the sharp edges of terror, but after 3 days of liquid courage, even alcohol couldn't quiet the growing certainty that something fundamental about my reality had shifted in ways I didn't understand. It was on the 4th night that Grandpa Harold finally reached the front of the corridor. He stood just beyond the glass now, close enough that I could have reached out and touched his face if the mirror's surface hadn't separated us. His mouth moved in what appeared to be urgent speech, though no sound penetrated the barrier between his world and mine. He gestured repeatedly towards something behind him, down the dark corridor I couldn't fully see, his expression growing more desperate with each failed attempt at communication. That's when I noticed my reflection had begun to change. Subtly at first, a slight tilt of the head, a shift in posture that didn't match my own movement. But as the hours passed, the discrepancies became more pronounced. While I paced anxiously in front of the mirror, my reflection stood perfectly still. When I ran my hands through my hair in frustration, my mirror self kept its arms at its sides. Most disturbing of all, when exhaustion finally forced me to sit down, my reflection remained standing, watching me with an expression that grew increasingly alien with each passing moment. By dawn, I could no longer tell which version of myself was real. The man in the mirror seemed more solid somehow, more present, while I felt increasingly translucent, as if I were becoming the reflection while something else took my place in the real world. The thought sent waves of nausea rolling through my stomach, and I found myself dry heaving over the kitchen sink while cold sweat beaded on my forehead. I called in sick to work, knowing I was in no condition to function around other people. My supervisor's voice sounded distorted through the phone, as if he were speaking from a great distance, and I had to concentrate intensely to form coherent responses to his questions about when I might return. Everything felt muffled, disconnected, as if a thick layer of glass had been placed between me and the rest of the world. The breaking point came on the 5th night. I'd been staring at the mirror for hours, watching Grandpa Harold's increasingly frantic attempts to communicate, when my reflection finally moved independently. It raised its hand, my hand, and pressed its palm against the glass from the other side. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and accompanied by an expression I'd never seen on my own face. A cold, calculating smile that transformed my familiar features into something predatory. My actual hand remained at my side, fingers trembling with terror, while my reflection maintained its position against the glass. Through the surface, I could see Grandpa Harold backing away down the corridor, his expression shifting from urgency to horror as he watched something behind my reflection approach. His mouth opened in what appeared to be a scream, though still no sound reached me, and he turned to run deeper into the impossible space beyond the mirror. That's when I understood with crystal clarity what was happening. Something had been waiting in that corridor, something that had used Grandpa Harold's familiar presence to lure me into prolonged contact with the mirror. Each hour I'd spent staring into its depths had strengthened whatever force existed on the other side, allowing it to gradually assume my reflection while I remained trapped in the real world, growing more translucent with each passing day. The realization hit me like a physical blow, doubling me over with the force of understanding. I wasn't going crazy, I was being replaced. Whatever looked back at me through the glass wore my face, but harbored intentions I couldn't fathom, and it was growing stronger while I grew weaker. I stumbled to the kitchen and grabbed the largest hammer from my toolbox, its weight reassuring in my trembling hands. My reflection watched me approach, that alien smile growing wider as I raised the hammer above my head. For a moment, we stared at each other, predator and prey, original and copy, and I saw my own face transformed into something I didn't recognize. The hammer connected with the mirror's surface in an explosion of silver shards and impossible light. The glass shattered like a frozen pond in spring, each fragment catching and reflecting the overhead light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. But as the pieces fell, I caught glimpses of that corridor in each shard, dozens of fragmentary views of the space that shouldn't exist, each showing Grandpa Harold running deeper into darkness while something pursued him with my stolen face. The smell of cherry tobacco vanished instantly, replaced by the sharp odor of metal and broken glass. The oppressive weight that had settled over my apartment lifted like fog before a strong wind, and for the first time in days I could breathe without feeling like I was suffocating. I swept up the fragments carefully, each piece still showing hints of that impossible corridor, until I wrapped them in newspaper and deposited them in the building's dumpster. The wall above my fireplace looked empty now, scarred by the anchor holes, but I felt no desire to hang anything else there. Some spaces were meant to remain vacant. 3 weeks later, I found a photograph tucked behind my dresser, one that hadn't been there before. It showed Grandpa Harold's farmhouse, but the image was wrong somehow. The windows reflected not the Ohio countryside, but the interior of my apartment, and in one of those reflected windows, I could see a figure that might have been me, standing in front of a broken mirror, with fragments still glittering at my feet. I burned the photograph that same night, watching the flames consume the impossible image until nothing remained but ash. But sometimes when I'm shaving in the bathroom mirror or catching my reflection in shop windows, I notice small discrepancies. A gesture that doesn't quite match my intention, an expression that feels foreign on my face. And sometimes, late at night when the apartment is quiet, I catch the faintest hint of cherry tobacco in the air, as if somewhere in the space between what is and what shouldn't be, my grandfather is still running down an endless corridor, trying to warn someone who can no longer hear his voice. The mirror is gone, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever I saw in its depths left something behind. Not in my apartment, but in me. Something that watches through my eyes and waits for another chance to step from reflection into reality. I've stopped looking too closely at mirrors now, afraid of what I might see looking back, afraid that next time the face in the glass might smile at me with teeth that aren't quite my own. The empty space above my fireplace remains a reminder that some bargains are too dangerous to accept, some reflections too honest to bear. And every morning when I wake, I have to resist the urge to check if my shadow still follows behind me, or if it too has developed ideas of its own. Story 13. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet like dying men, each step announcing my presence to whatever dwelled in the shadows of that cramped Parisian attic. 3 weeks had passed since I'd fled London, fled the suffocating expectations, the failed manuscript, the mounting debts that clung to me like a second skin. Paris had promised anonymity, a chance to disappear into its labyrinthine streets and narrow staircases that spiraled upward toward forgotten spaces where desperate souls could rent corners of neglect for almost nothing. The subletting arrangement had been almost too perfect. A friend of a friend knew someone who had a space. No questions asked. Cash only. Utilities included. The building squatted on Rue de la Gaîté like a weathered gargoyle, its facade cracked and stained with decades of rain and resignation. 5 flights up, past apartments that exhaled the ghosts of countless lives through their thin walls, lay my sanctuary, a triangular wedge of space beneath slanted eaves where the ceiling pressed down like a coffin lid. But it was the typewriter that should have warned me. I discovered it on my second night, emerging from beneath a moth-eaten cloth in the corner furthest from the single dormer window. An ancient Olympia SM9, its black metal surface worn smooth by countless fingers, keys yellowed like old teeth. The previous tenant must have abandoned it, I reasoned, though the landlord's assistant had assured me through broken English that the space had been empty for months. The machine sat on a small wooden desk that faced the window, positioned as if someone had been watching the street below while working. When I lifted the cloth, dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light, but the typewriter itself bore no dust whatsoever. Its surface gleamed as though recently polished, and when I pressed the A key experimentally, it struck the ribbon with crisp precision. That first week, I ignored it entirely. My laptop provided everything I needed for the novel I was attempting to resurrect from the ashes of my London failure. I'd arranged my makeshift desk on the opposite side of the attic, positioning my back to the typewriter as I worked. Yet I found myself glancing over my shoulder with increasing frequency, as if expecting to find someone hunched over its keys. The sounds began on the 8th night. I'd been struggling with a particularly difficult passage when the first click echoed through the attic. Sharp, metallic, unmistakable. The sound of a typewriter key striking paper. My fingers froze over my laptop keyboard, heart suddenly hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. I held my breath, straining to hear above the blood rushing in my ears. Click, 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 click. Slowly, I turned in my chair. The typewriter sat exactly as I'd left it, bathed in moonlight from the dormer window. No paper in the roller, no hands at the keys. Yet as I watched, transfixed, another soft click drifted across the attic. I convinced myself it was the building settling, the old wood contracting in the cool night air. Buildings in this part of Paris had stood for centuries. They were entitled to their creaks and groans. I returned to my work, but the words wouldn't come. Every few minutes, another click would pierce the silence, each one sending a fresh wave of adrenaline coursing through my veins. By morning, exhaustion weighed on me like a physical thing. My eyes burned. My hands trembled slightly as I made coffee on the small camping stove that served as my kitchen. In the harsh light of day, the previous night's fears seemed ridiculous. The typewriter sat innocuous in its corner, just another piece of abandoned furniture. But that evening, as shadows lengthened across the slanted floor, I found myself unable to concentrate on anything but the machine. When darkness fell and the clicking resumed, I forced myself to investigate. My bare feet whispered across the floorboards as I approached, every nerve ending alive with electric tension. The typewriter remained motionless, yet the sounds continued. Not random clicks now, but rhythmic, purposeful, like someone typing steadily, deliberately. I leaned closer, searching for any explanation, any rational cause. The keys showed no movement. The ribbon sat undisturbed, but the clicking continued with mechanical precision. On impulse, I grabbed a sheet of paper from my dwindling supply and fed it into the roller. The clicking stopped immediately, as if whatever invisible presence had been waiting for this exact moment. The silence that followed felt pregnant with anticipation, heavy with unspoken possibilities. I backed away, skin crawling with the sensation of being watched. Sleep eluded me entirely that night as I lay rigid on my narrow mattress, straining to hear any sound from the typewriter's corner. The silence stretched on, more unnerving than any noise could have been. The next morning brought the first revelation that would shatter my attempts at rational explanation. Paper protruded from the typewriter's roller, the same sheet I'd inserted the night before. With trembling fingers, I pulled it free and held it up to the window's light. Words marched across the page in neat rows, typed in what appeared to be Portuguese. Despite never having studied the language, I understood every word with crystalline clarity, as if the meaning bypassed my conscious mind and embedded itself directly into my understanding. The text described a dream, my dream from the previous night, recounted in perfect detail. The nightmare where I'd found myself trapped in an endless library, searching desperately for a book that would explain why everyone I'd ever known had forgotten my existence. Every detail was captured with disturbing precision. The smell of moldering paper, the way the shelves stretched impossibly upward into darkness, the growing certainty that something malevolent stalked me between the stacks. But here was the impossible part. The text was dated with the previous evening's date, time-stamped hours before I'd even fallen asleep. My hands shook as I read and reread the pages, searching for some explanation that wouldn't require abandoning everything I believed about reality. The typing was flawless, not a single error or correction mark. The Portuguese flowed with literary elegance, far beyond what any translation program could produce. And the details of my dream, no one could have known those details except me. That day passed in a haze of mounting paranoia. I found myself checking the typewriter obsessively, searching for hidden mechanisms, recording devices, any technological explanation for what I'd witnessed. The machine yielded no secrets. Its interior held only the expected mechanical components: keys, springs, ribbon, rollers. Nothing that could account for autonomous operation or prescient knowledge of my dreams. As evening approached, dread settled over me like a suffocating blanket. My skin felt too tight, as if my body had become an ill-fitting costume. Every shadow seemed to writhe with malevolent life. Every sound magnified until the building's normal settling felt like approaching footsteps. I tried to stay awake, positioned myself in full view of the typewriter with my laptop open, determined to witness whatever force animated the machine. But exhaustion proved stronger than fear, and sometime after midnight, sleep claimed me despite my vigilance. I dreamed of drowning in an ocean of ink, black words swirling around me like hungry sharks, each letter sharp enough to cut flesh. In the dream, I could hear typing echoing from the surface far above, growing faster and more frantic as I sank deeper into the linguistic abyss. Morning brought another sheet of paper in the typewriter, another perfect Portuguese account of my nocturnal visions. This time, additional text followed the dream narrative, a single line that made my blood freeze in my veins. Três capítulos restam antes do último amanhecer. 3 chapters remain before the last dawn. The words burned themselves into my consciousness with the weight of prophecy. Whatever force inhabited this machine was counting down to something, marking time until some undefined conclusion. The phrase, último amanecer, carried implications that made my stomach clench with primal terror. I tried to leave that day, stuffing my few possessions into my travel bag with desperate haste. But when I reached for the door handle, my hand froze inches away. Some invisible force seemed to emanate from the typewriter behind me, a gravitational pull that made my bones ache with the effort of resistance. The very air felt thick, viscous, as if I were trying to move through honey. Panic clawed at my throat as I realized I couldn't leave. Not physically couldn't. My legs worked fine. My muscles responded to my commands. But some deeper compulsion held me fast, a certainty that abandoning this place would result in consequences far worse than staying. The remainder of that day crawled by with agonizing slowness. I couldn't focus on my writing, couldn't eat more than a few bites of stale bread, couldn't think about anything except the machine waiting in its corner like a patient predator. As darkness fell, I felt its presence intensify, a psychic weight pressing against my consciousness. That night, The clicking began earlier and continued longer. I lay curled on my mattress, covers pulled over my head like a child hiding from monsters, as the steady rhythm filled the attic. It sounded different now, more urgent, more insistent. Between the clicks, I could swear I heard other sounds. The whisper of paper being fed into the roller, the bells signaling the end of each line, even the soft thump of the carriage return. But it was impossible. I could see the typewriter clearly through a gap in my covers, illuminated by streetlight from the window. No hands worked its keys, no paper emerged from thin air. Yet the sounds continued, methodical and purposeful, painting invisible words in the darkness. When morning came, 2 sheets waited for me. The first contained another dream transcript, a nightmare where I'd been forced to watch myself aging rapidly in a mirror, while invisible hands typed my obituary in a language that shifted and changed, even as I tried to read it. The second sheet held new text, a message that made my knees buckle. Dois capítulos restam. A história clama por seu final verdadeiro. 2 chapters remain. The story cries out for its true ending. The countdown continued, but now came an additional demand. The story required its true ending. What story? My abandoned novel? The strange accounts of my dreams? Or something larger, more encompassing, the story of my life itself? That day I discovered I couldn't write anything else. Every time I opened my laptop and tried to work on my novel, the words would disappear as quickly as I typed them. The screen would flicker, sentences would vanish, entire paragraphs would transform into incomprehensible symbols before my eyes. Only when I turned away from my own work could I think clearly. Could my hands stop trembling enough to perform simple tasks? The typewriter dominated my thoughts with increasing intensity. Even when I wasn't looking at it directly, I could feel its presence like a physical weight. The air around it seemed to shimmer occasionally, as if heat waves were rising from its metal surface. Sometimes, from the corner of my eye, I caught glimpses of movement, a suggestion of fingers dancing over keys, the phantom outline of someone hunched over the machine in concentrated effort. By the 4th night, my nerves had frayed to breaking point. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to harbor watching eyes. I'd stopped trying to eat regularly, stopped bothering with personal hygiene, stopped pretending I had any control over my situation. My reflection in the small mirror above my makeshift sink showed a wild-eyed stranger, hollow-cheeked and trembling, haunted by forces beyond comprehension. That night's dream was the most vivid yet. I stood in this very attic, but it was decades earlier. A thin man in a worn suit sat at the typewriter, his fingers flying over the keys with desperate speed, papers scattered around his feet like fallen leaves, covered in the same elegant Portuguese script. As I watched, frozen by dream logic, he suddenly stopped typing and turned to face me. His eyes held a terror so complete, so absolute, that I woke screaming. The morning sheet contained not just the dream account, but additional text that made my blood turn to ice water. Capítulo resta. Ele também compreendeu tarde demais. Escreva o final antes do amanhecer, ou torne-se parte da história para sempre. 1 chapter remains. He too understood too late. Write the ending before dawn, or become part of the story forever. The message was clear. I was not the first person to experience this horror. The previous tenant, the man from my dream, had faced the same impossible choice. And from the way he'd looked at me in that vision, the absolute terror in his eyes, I understood he had failed whatever test this malevolent force had set for him. As the final day wore on, reality seemed to become increasingly unstable around me. The walls of the attic appeared to pulse slightly, breathing with a rhythm that matched my panicked heartbeat. The typewriter's presence grew overwhelming, a psychic beacon that made concentration impossible. I could feel it watching me, waiting, counting down the hours until some predetermined deadline. Shadows moved wrong in my peripheral vision, suggesting shapes that shouldn't exist. The sound of typing echoed from empty corners of the room, phantom keys striking phantom paper. Sometimes I could hear voices whispering in Portuguese just below the threshold of understanding, urgent conversations discussing my fate in terms I couldn't quite grasp. When darkness fell on that final night, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever force controlled the typewriter would demand its ending before dawn. The machine itself seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, its keys reflecting silver like bared teeth. The air around it crackled with potential energy, like the moment before lightning strikes. I approached it slowly, my bare feet silent on the floorboards that no longer groaned beneath my weight. The typewriter waited, patient and eternal, a gateway between worlds that demanded its tribute of words. With shaking hands, I fed a fresh sheet of paper into the roller and positioned my fingers over the keys. The metal felt warm beneath my touch, almost alive, pulsing with an energy that traveled up my arms and into my chest. As soon as my fingers made contact, words began flowing through me, not from my mind, but through it, as if I'd become a conduit for some vast, ancient intelligence. The story that emerged was not my own, yet intimately connected to my experience. It told of the typewriter's true nature, a device that existed partially outside normal reality, fed by the dreams and fears of those who encountered it. Each person who failed to provide the ending it demanded became trapped within its mechanism, their consciousness absorbed into its growing collection of stories. The man from my dreams, the previous tenant, was still there, along with dozens of others stretching back decades. They lived now as characters in an endless narrative, doomed to replay their fears and failures for eternity, while the machine waited for new victims to continue their tales. But the typewriter offered a choice, as it always did. Write the true ending, not of any single story, but of the entire cycle. And it would release all those trapped within its impossible mechanism, fail, and join them in their textual prison forever. My fingers moved without conscious direction, typing words in Portuguese that I somehow understood completely. The ending I wrote was simple. The machine's power came from isolation, from trapping individuals in spaces where no one would witness their disappearance. But if someone chose to break that pattern, to expose the typewriter's nature to the world, its hold would be broken. As the final words appeared on the page, dawn light began filtering through the dormer window. The typewriter shuddered beneath my hands, its warm metal suddenly cold as ice. A sound like distant screaming echoed through the attic, growing fainter until it disappeared entirely. When I pulled the completed page from the roller, it crumbled to dust in my hands. The typewriter itself began to fade, becoming translucent, then invisible, until only an empty desk remained in the corner. I left Paris that morning, taking nothing but my laptop and the clothes on my back. The story I've written here is my testimony, my attempt to fulfill the promise I made to break the cycle. Whether the typewriter is truly gone, or merely waiting for its next victim in some other forgotten attic, I cannot say. But sometimes, in the deep of night, I still hear the phantom clicking of keys that no longer exist, and I wonder if my ending was enough, or if I've simply become part of a larger story that continues to unfold in ways I cannot imagine. The last chapter is written, but the story never truly ends. Story 14. The silence in the mountains has teeth. I discovered this truth 3 days into my retreat at the cabin, when the absence of civilization's white noise began gnawing at my consciousness like a persistent itch. The Serra da Mantiqueira stretched endlessly beyond my windows, a sea of green that rolled toward horizons I couldn't see, punctuated only by the skeletal fingers of dead trees that clawed at the perpetually overcast sky. The cabin's previous occupant had left behind more than dust and cobwebs. Tucked beneath a moth-eaten blanket in the corner of the main room sat an antique crystal radio set, its brass fittings tarnished black and its wooden case warped from decades of mountain humidity. The thing looked like it belonged in a museum, not in this forgotten rental property perched on the edge of nowhere. I should have left it alone. The first night I touched it, my fingertips came away stained with something that wasn't quite rust. The metallic taste in my mouth afterward lingered for hours, sharp and bitter like old pennies. But curiosity had always been my weakness. and the radio called to me with the same inexplicable magnetism that had drawn me to this isolated refuge in the first place. There was no antenna connected to the device, no power source that I could identify. The crystal detector sat naked in its brass housing, a chunk of galena that gleamed dully in the cabin's inadequate lamplight. According to everything I knew about electronics, the thing shouldn't have worked at all. Yet when I pressed the corroded headphones to my ears and adjusted the cat's whisker contact against the crystal's surface, static filled my skull like angry wasps. The first transmission came at 2:47 a.m. on my second night. Through the hiss and crackle, a voice emerged, desperate, breathless, human. The words sent ice crawling up my spine. Day 3 in the cabin. The thing in the woods is getting closer. If anyone receives this, I'm at coordinates 22 degrees, 43 minutes south. The radio. God. The radio is the only thing that works. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the coordinates on my phone. The numbers corresponded exactly to my current location. The transmission lasted 37 seconds before dissolving back into static. I sat frozen in the darkness, the headphones still pressed against my ears, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal. The voice had been my own. Sleep became impossible. I paced the cabin's cramped interior until dawn, cataloging every creak and whisper the old structure made as it settled. The mountains beyond the windows seemed to press closer in the pre-dawn darkness, their slopes shifting and breathing like the flanks of some massive, slumbering beast. When morning finally crawled across the peaks, I told myself it had been a dream. Stress from the city, from the job I'd fled, from the relationship that had imploded spectacularly 3 weeks earlier. The mind played tricks when pushed too far, I reasoned. The isolation was getting to me faster than I'd anticipated. But that evening, as twilight painted the mountains the color of old blood, I found myself drawn back to the radio. This time the transmission was longer, clearer. My own voice again, but older somehow, rougher with fear and exhaustion. Day 8. It's been circling the cabin for 3 days now. I can hear it scratching at the walls after midnight. The radio picked up another signal today. Someone else in the same situation, same coordinates, but from 2089. Christ, how many of us are trapped in this loop? My mouth went dry. The date stamp my future self mentioned was 43 years from now. The impossibility of it should have provided comfort, should have confirmed that my deteriorating mental state was playing elaborate tricks. Instead, dread settled in my stomach like a stone. I began keeping detailed logs, documenting every transmission. They came sporadically, sometimes twice in a night, sometimes not for days. But they always featured my voice, always described my exact situation with minor variations. In some, I'd been at the cabin for weeks. In others, months. One transmission, crackling through what sounded like decades of temporal static, spoke of years. The pattern became clear after a week of listening. Each transmission came from a future version of myself, trapped in the same cabin, facing the same mounting terror. They spoke of something in the woods, something that stalked the perimeter of the property but never quite revealed itself. They described the radio as both salvation and curse, the only link to the outside world, but one that showed only endless repetitions of the same nightmare. My appetite vanished. Sleep came in fragments haunted by the sound of my own voice pleading across impossible distances of time. The mirror showed a face growing gaunt and hollow-eyed, the beard I'd been cultivating now patchy and unkempt. My hands developed a persistent tremor that made simple tasks, writing, eating, operating the radio, increasingly difficult. On the 10th night, I heard something outside. The sound came just after midnight, a rhythmic scraping against the cabin's north wall, slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. My entire body went rigid, sweat beading on my forehead despite the mountain chill. The scraping continued for exactly 3 minutes before stopping. Silence returned, but it felt different now, pregnant with watching presence. I knew I should investigate, should look outside to see if fallen branches or some animal had caused the noise. Instead, I sat paralyzed in the radio's glow, headphones clamped over my ears, listening to the static while my pulse thundered in my temples. At 2:15 a.m., another transmission. Day 10. It made contact tonight. The scratching. I know you're hearing this, past self. You're sitting there right now, aren't you? Afraid to look outside? Don't. Whatever you do, don't look. The voice was definitely mine, but strained to the breaking point. In the background, I could hear the same scratching sound I just experienced, but amplified, multiplied, as if dozens of somethings were clawing at the cabin's walls simultaneously. My future self continued. The radio isn't just receiving these transmissions, it's creating them. Every time you listen, you're feeding the loop, strengthening it. But I can't stop. None of us can stop. We're all caught in the same web, and it's hungry. The transmission cut to static, leaving me alone with the deafening silence of the mountains. I ripped the headphones from my ears and stumbled backward, knocking over the chair. The radio sat innocuously on its table, crystal detector gleaming like an eye in the lamplight. Every rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible. Temporal paradoxes, causality loops, they were fiction, not reality. But my trembling hands and the taste of copper in my mouth told a different story. The next few days blurred together. I tried to leave the cabin twice, but my car wouldn't start. The engine turned over but never caught, as if some vital component had been disconnected. My cell phone showed no signal, no matter where I carried it on the property. The landline I'd noticed my first day had never worked. The wires leading to it were severed, had been severed long before my arrival. I was trapped, and the realization brought with it a claustrophobic panic that made breathing difficult. The mountains that had seemed peaceful now felt like prison walls, their slopes pressing inward with each passing hour. The transmissions continued. Some nights brought multiple signals, overlapping conversations between different versions of myself scattered across decades. I learned that the cabin had been built on the site of an older structure that had burned down in the 1940s. Before that, local indigenous peoples had avoided the area, considering it cursed ground where time bent back on itself. The entity in the woods, my future selves spoke of it with growing familiarity, like discussing an unwelcome neighbor. It fed on temporal displacement, they said, growing stronger with each iteration of the loop. The radio was its web, and we were the flies. On the 15th night I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees, too tall and angular to be human, too fluid to be natural. It paused at the edge of the clearing around the cabin, and I felt its attention like ice water in my veins. For one heart-stopping moment, it turned toward the window where I stood watching, and I glimpsed something that my mind refused to process. Geometry that folded in on itself, features that shifted between familiar and utterly alien. I stumbled away from the window, bile rising in my throat. Behind me, the radio crackled to life without my touch. Day 15, you saw it, didn't you? Now it knows you're aware. The loop is almost complete. Soon you'll be sending these same warnings to yourself, trapped in the same endless cycle. Unless... The transmission paused, filled with the sound of ragged breathing that matched my own. Unless one of us breaks the pattern, destroys the radio, severs the connection. It might kill us all, every iteration, but it might also set us free. My hand shook as I approached the device. The crystal detector pulsed with its own inner light now, and the brass fittings were warm to the touch despite the cabin's chill. Destroying it felt like contemplating suicide. If my future self was right, it might erase every version of me trapped in this temporal web. But the alternative was worse. An eternity of watching the thing in the woods grow stronger, feeding on our fear, our displacement, our endless repetition of the same doomed scenario. I raised the radio above my head, feeling its weight, its warmth, the subtle vibration that suggested it was far more than wood and metal and crystal. The static from the headphones had become a whisper. Dozens of my own voices pleading, warning, begging. The crash, when it came, was surprisingly small. Components scattered across the floor, brass fittings, splintered wood, the crystal detector that rolled to rest against the wall like a dying star. Silence fell over the cabin, complete and profound. No static, no whispers, no scratching from outside. Even the wind in the trees had stopped. Then, slowly, like a held breath being released, the world began to move again. My phone chimed with received messages, dozens of them from the outside world I'd forgotten existed. The car engine turned over smoothly when I tried it, purring with mechanical contentment. I left the cabin that morning and never returned. The rental agency seemed confused when I called to report the broken radio. They insisted there had never been any such device on the property. The locals I spoke to in the nearest town had no knowledge of the area being cursed or avoided. But sometimes, late at night when the city's noise fades to a whisper, I hear static in my ears. And I wonder if I truly broke the loop, or if I simply joined a different one. Somewhere in the mountains, in cabins that exist in the spaces between seconds, other versions of myself might still be listening to that crystal radio, trapped in their own endless cycles of discovery and terror. The silence in the mountains has teeth, and sometimes I fear it's still feeding. Story 15. The water never lies. That's what they tell you in diving school, repeated like a mantra until it burrows into your skull and makes a home there. Water doesn't deceive, doesn't pretend, doesn't play games with your mind. It simply is, transparent, honest, unforgiving. But standing in that sterile training facility at 11 p.m., watching the moonlight filter through grimy windows onto an empty pool deck, I was about to learn that sometimes the absence of water can be the greatest lie of all. The Advanced Deep Chamber Certification course had been my obsession for months. Most recreational divers never bothered with it. Too expensive, too dangerous, too demanding. But I wasn't most divers. I'd spent 3 years working oil rigs in the Gulf, another 2 doing underwater welding in the North Sea. I thought I'd seen everything the depths could throw at a man. I thought wrong. The facility squatted on the outskirts of town like a concrete tumor, all sharp angles and institutional gray. Inside, the training pool dominated the main floor, a circular chamber 40 feet across, designed to simulate the crushing pressures and disorienting darkness of true deep water environments. During the day, it filled with regulated chlorinated water, monitored by a dozen sensors and safety systems. At night, for the advanced exercises, they drained it completely. Night diving without water, the instructor had explained during orientation, his weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. Sounds crazy, but it teaches you to trust your instruments when your eyes betray you. He'd tapped his depth gauge with a yellowed fingernail. In real deep water ops, your gear tells you the truth when everything else lies. I should have asked more questions, should have wondered why they needed to simulate water that wasn't there. Should have noticed how the other students, all experienced commercial divers like myself, avoided eye contact when the night exercise was mentioned. Should have paid attention to the way the instructor's hands trembled slightly when he demonstrated the equipment. But I didn't. I was too focused on the certification, too hungry for the advancement opportunities it would bring, too blind to see the warning signs scattered around me like breadcrumbs leading into a dark forest. The evening of the night exercise, 6 of us gathered in the equipment room as shadows lengthened outside. The instructor moved through his pre-dive checklist with mechanical precision, his voice flat and emotionless. We would descend into the empty chamber wearing full gear, relying entirely on our instruments to navigate in complete darkness. The pool's lighting system would be shut off, simulating the absolute black of deep ocean trenches. "Remember," he said, not meeting our eyes, "trust your depth gauge. It's calibrated for this exercise. Don't let your brain override what the instruments tell you." I strapped on my gear with practiced efficiency, the familiar weight of the tank, the secure seal of the mask, the gentle hiss of regulated air. The depth gauge hung at my side, its luminous dial glowing softly green. Everything felt normal, routine, safe. The descent into the empty chamber began at exactly 11:30 p.m. The ladder rungs were cold against my gloved hands as I climbed down into the concrete bowl. The others followed. their breathing apparatus creating a mechanical symphony of regulated exhalation. At the bottom, we formed a circle as instructed, kneeling on the rough concrete floor. Above us, the instructor's voice echoed from the observation deck, tinny through the intercom system. Beginning night simulation in 3, 2, 1. The lights died. Absolute darkness swallowed us whole, so complete it seemed to have physical weight pressing against my eyes. I forced myself to breathe slowly, steadily, fighting the immediate surge of claustrophobia that always came with total sensory deprivation. This was normal. This was part of the training. This was... My depth gauge read 30 feet. I blinked hard behind my mask, certain I'd misread it. But the glowing numbers remained unchanged, 30 feet below surface. Impossible. I was sitting on solid concrete, breathing normally through my regulator, surrounded by empty air. Yet my instrument insisted I was 30 feet underwater. Trust your instruments. The instructor's words echoed in my memory. Don't let your brain override what the instruments tell you. My heart began to hammer against my ribs as I tried to make sense of the contradiction. Around me, I could hear the steady breathing of the other students, the subtle sounds of movement on concrete. Everything suggested we were exactly where we should be, in an empty pool, performing a routine exercise. But the gauge didn't lie. Water never lies. That's when I saw the first silhouette. It moved at the edge of my vision, a darker shadow against the absolute black. I turned my head, straining to focus, but saw nothing. Just emptiness and the faint green glow of my instruments. I told myself it was imagination, the mind's tendency to create patterns in sensory void. Then I saw another. This one was clearer, more defined, a human shape moving with slow, deliberate steps across what should have been the concrete floor. But if my depth gauge was accurate, if we really were 30 feet underwater, then that figure was walking along the pool bottom, moving through water as if it were air. My breathing accelerated despite my efforts to control it. The regulator hissed more rapidly, each inhalation sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. Sweat broke out across my forehead, cold and clammy beneath the mask. I reached out blindly, trying to feel for one of the other students, desperate for contact with something real and solid. My hand found empty space. Panic began to claw its way up my throat. I should have been able to touch someone. We'd formed a tight circle, no more than arm's length apart. But now there was nothing around me except darkness and the impossible pressure reading on my gauge. I called out, my voice muffled by the regulator, but heard no response. Only the mechanical sound of my own breathing and a faint rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The silhouettes multiplied. They emerged from the darkness like fragments of nightmare made manifest. Dozens of shadowy figures moving in slow procession around the perimeter of the chamber. They walked with the weightless gait of people underwater, yet made no splash, disturbed no surface. Their forms were indistinct but unmistakably human, arms swinging in measured rhythm, heads turning occasionally as if searching for something, or someone. I fumbled for my emergency light, a high-powered LED designed to cut through murky water. My fingers trembled as I found the switch and clicked it on. The beam lanced out into the darkness, illuminating. Nothing. The light revealed only empty concrete and air, exactly what should have been there. No figures, no movement, no signs of the impossible procession I'd witnessed moments before. But my depth gauge still read 30 feet, and the absence of evidence felt more terrifying than any confirmation would have been. I swept the light in wide arcs, searching desperately for the other students, for any sign that this was still a normal training exercise. The beam picked up scuff marks on the concrete, the metal rungs of the ladder leading up to the observation deck, the drain grates set into the floor. Everything appeared exactly as it should in an empty pool, except for the water. As I watched in growing horror, my light beam began to bend and scatter as if passing through liquid. The edges of the concrete walls rippled and distorted, taking on the fluid characteristics of an underwater environment. Yet I could breathe normally, felt no pressure against my body, heard no sound of water movement. The figures returned the moment I turned off the light. This time they were closer, their procession tightening into a spiral that centered on my position. I could see them more clearly now, tall shapes in diving gear not unlike my own, moving with the deliberate slowness of people fighting against water resistance. Their faces were hidden behind masks, but something in their posture suggested an awareness of my presence. My chest began to burn as hyperventilation set in. The regulator struggled to keep up with my rapid, shallow breathing. Cold sweat ran down my spine, soaking through the wetsuit that should have been unnecessary in an empty chamber. Every rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible, that I was experiencing some kind of breakdown or hallucination. But the depth gauge never wavered, 30 feet below surface. I tried to swim upward, making the familiar motions of ascending through water. My body moved normally through empty air, but the gauge reading remained constant. The surface, if there was a surface, seemed infinitely distant. Around me, the ghostly figures continued their endless march, occasionally turning eyeless masks in my direction. The tapping sound grew louder. It came in measured intervals, like Morse code or a distress signal. Metal against metal, echoing through the chamber with increasing urgency. I realized with growing dread that it matched the rhythm of the figures' movement, as if their footsteps were somehow generating the sound despite making no contact with solid surfaces. That's when I understood. They weren't walking on the pool floor. They were walking on something 30 feet below it, in a space that shouldn't exist, following paths through phantom water that registered on my instruments but nowhere else. My air supply gauge showed half full, though I felt like I'd been breathing for hours. Time had become elastic in the absolute darkness, stretching and contracting without reference points. I had no idea how long the exercise was supposed to last. No way to contact the surface. No escape from the impossible situation playing out around me. The figures began to converge. Their spiral tightened with each revolution, bringing them closer to my position with every pass. I could see details now that made my sanity fray at the edges. The way their movements created distortions in the air, as if they displaced invisible water. The manner in which their equipment seemed both familiar and wrong, like diving gear designed for an environment I couldn't comprehend. One of them stopped directly in front of me. It stood motionless for what felt like eternity, its masked face tilted at an angle that suggested examination or recognition. Through the darkness, I thought I could see something glowing behind its faceplate. Not the warm light of human eyes, but something cold and distant, like phosphorescence in deep ocean trenches. My depth gauge began to fluctuate. The reading dropped to 29 feet, then 28, as if I were somehow ascending through water that wasn't there. But instead of relief, I felt only increased terror. If the gauge was detecting my ascent, it meant the phantom water was real enough to register on my instruments, real enough to potentially drown me in plain air. The figure reached out one gloved hand toward my mask. I jerked backward, kicking frantically against nothing, and felt my airline snag on something that shouldn't have existed. The regulator hissed angrily as pressure changed, and for a terrifying moment I thought I might actually be underwater, might actually be drowning 30 feet below the surface of an empty pool. Then the lights came on. Harsh fluorescent illumination flooded the chamber, washing away the shadows and figures like a tide of mundane reality. I found myself sprawled alone on the concrete floor, breathing apparatus functioning normally, depth gauge reading 0. The other students were gone. The instructor was gone. I was completely alone in an empty concrete chamber at the bottom of a drained pool, but my equipment told a different story. The dive computer on my wrist showed a logged descent to 30 feet, a 20-minute bottom time, and a recent ascent to the surface. According to the instruments, I had just completed a normal dive in 30 feet of water. The air consumption readings matched what they should be for that depth and duration. I climbed out of the chamber on shaking legs, my mind reeling between what I had experienced and what the evidence suggested. The facility was empty, dark except for emergency lighting. A note taped to the equipment room door apologized for a technical malfunction that had forced early termination of the exercise. But there was something else. A logbook left open on the instructor's desk, filled with entries from previous night exercises. Page after page of reports describing identical experiences. Figures in the darkness, impossible depth readings, equipment that insisted on the presence of water where none existed. The final entry was dated that very night, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. The pool remembers what was here before. The instruments don't lie about what they measure, even when we can't see it. Some things leave impressions deeper than we can drain. I left the facility that night with my certification incomplete and my worldview permanently fractured. The depth gauge never worked properly again. It would randomly spike to 30 feet while sitting on my kitchen table, as if detecting phantom water that followed me home. I never dove professionally again. But sometimes in the darkness before sleep, I still hear that rhythmic tapping and feel the weight of invisible water pressing down from 30 feet above, where it shouldn't be but somehow always is.